If you're ready to rest, you're in the right place. Close your eyes, relax your body, and drift into a slower time. You wake up to the sounds of a bustling ancient Athens, a city that's far from the quiet, sun-drenched ruins tourists snap selfies in front of today. The skies are brilliant blue, sure, but the air is filled with the shouts of farmers haggling over barley, the clatter of pots from nearby homes, and the shuffle of slaves heading to the agora with their masters. The romanticized idea of a serene, noble Athens crumbles quickly when faced with the earthy grit of everyday life. Grab your chiton and sandals, because today you're going to experience the gritty reality of the city-state's economic engine, agriculture. Now, let's talk about farming in ancient Greece. Forget those pastoral paintings of idyllic farms. These guys were the backbone of the city, yes, but with a spine that was perpetually sore from back-breaking labour. The soil in Attica, where Athens is located, is about as fertile as a rock concert, and that's being generous. Olives, grapes and barley are your mainstays, but even these require a Herculean effort to coax from the earth. With rudimentary tools like wooden ploughs and sickles, you're in for a slow and laborious day. The weather, as always, is a fickle partner. A dry season could spell disaster, and since there's no convenient Greek version of the Weather Channel, you're constantly at the mercy of the elements. Trust me, when Zeus is in a mood, your crop doesn't stand a chance. You're just hoping for a good harvest to avoid visiting the grumpy tax collector whose demands are as predictable as they are unwelcome. Speaking of taxes, let's debunk the myth of the self-sufficient Greek farmer. Sure, that image is as appealing as a hero's journey, but the truth is a bit more pedestrian. Taxes were a farmer's constant companion, hovering like a nosy neighbour. The state needed resources. Think military expansions, public projects, and those grandiose festivals that everyone talks about. You, dear farmer, are footing a fair chunk of that bill. But taxes aren't your only financial worry. Debt is another shadow lurking in the olive groves. Many farmers found themselves in a vicious cycle, borrowing to get through lean years, only to find themselves deeper in debt the next. As Solon, the wise Athenian lawmaker, once observed in the early 6th century BCE, the land itself had become enslaved by debt. His solution? Cancel the debts and abolish debt slavery. A radical move, but perhaps a necessary one to stop the land from being swallowed by the wealthier aristocrats. Now, don't think that just because you're a farmer, you're exempt from the hustle and bustle of trade. Athens was a hub of activity, and while you might be toiling under the sun, your produce is part of a larger economic puzzle. Grain shortages were common, and importing food was a crucial lifeline. The Athenians' diet depended heavily on grain from places like Egypt and the Black Sea region. And with the value of silver drachmas fluctuating like the modern stock market, you'd better keep your wits about you when trading. As you plod through the furrows, it's worth remembering that your efforts are not just feeding your family, but fueling the very core of Athenian life. Every grape fermented into wine and every olive pressed into oil represents a slice of economic stability. Yet this stability is as fragile as the pottery sold in the agora. A poor harvest, a sudden war, or an unexpected plague can upend everything. But for now, you shoulder your tools and continue, knowing that today's sweat might just be tomorrow's sustenance. So, as you navigate the rocky terrain of ancient Athenian agriculture, remember, those postcard-perfect visions of Greek farmers are as mythical as a minotaur. The reality is gritty, grueling, and about as glamorous as a day behind a mule. But hey, at least you're not alone. All around you, others are toiling just as hard, each one a cog in the grand Athenian machine, each one hoping that today's endless work will mean a little less worry tomorrow. So, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and lay down your tools, it's time to head into the bustling heart of ancient Athens, the agora. This wasn't just a place to haggle over olives and fish, but the social and economic lifeblood of the city. Imagine it as a chaotic blend of Wall Street, a social media feed, and your local farmers market. Here, citizens, metics and slaves all crossed paths, each navigating their unique roles in the grand Athenian drama. Let's start with the citizens, the creme de la creme of Greek society. Also, they'd like you to believe. Being a citizen meant you were one of the elite few, about 30,000 men in a city of 300,000 souls, with the right to vote, hold office, and own land. But hold your applause, women and slaves need not apply. In fact, women were about as close to political participation as a fish is to flying. They managed the home and raised future citizens, but their role in public life was non-existent. Meanwhile, citizens strutted around the agora, their chests puffed out like roosters, engaging in the heated debates and philosophical discussions that would have Socrates raising an eyebrow. Next up, the metics. Foreigners who, despite making up a significant chunk of the population, were as welcome in politics as a bull in a china shop. They paid taxes and served in the army, sure, but political power? Not a chance. Think of them as permanent residents without the hope of a green card. The economic engine of Athens relied heavily on these metics, who brought their skills and trade to the city. You might find them selling their goods in the agora, contributing to the vibrant marketplace scene. Yet, despite their contributions, the metics were denied the political voice that citizens took for granted. And let's not forget the slaves, who held up the bottom rung of the social ladder. In Athens, slaves were as much a part of the scenery as the Parthenon itself. They worked in households, quarries, and even rode the triremes that defended the city. You might be surprised to learn that slaves often lived and worked alongside their masters, sometimes even holding trusted positions. But make no mistake, they were property, and their lives were dictated by the whims of those who owned them. The myth of Greek democracy starts to crack when you realize that nearly half the population had no say in the grand decisions of the city. Now, let's talk money, because you can't buy that delicious-smelling fish with charm alone. The drachma, the currency jingling in your pouch, is your ticket to the goods and gossip of the agora. 1 drachma, the daily wage of a skilled worker, could buy you about 3 litres of olive oil or a pair of sandals. Talk about inflation control. But don't get too comfortable. Economic disparity was as real as Zeus's thunderbolts. The wealthy flaunted their silver drachmas like badges of honor, while the less fortunate scraped by, hoping for a decent meal. Shopping in ancient Athens wasn't just about transactions, it was a test of your bargaining skills. The agora was a cacophony of voices, each merchant trying to outshout the other. You had to haggle over prices as if your life depended on it, and sometimes it did. The economy was a living, breathing beast, with prices as unpredictable as Athenian weather. And while we're on the subject of unpredictability, let's debunk the golden myth of Greek democracy. We often picture Athens as the birthplace of democracy, where every citizen had a say, but reality was a bit less inclusive. Direct democracy was a privilege for the few, not the many. Only adult male citizens could vote, which meant that women, slaves, and metics were as voiceless as a mime in a courtroom. This was less of a democracy and more of an exclusive club with a strict dress code. The agora wasn't just a marketplace, it was a stage for political theatre. Citizens gathered to discuss everything from military campaigns to public festivals. It was the Twitter feed of ancient Athens, where ideas were exchanged as often as goods. Yet, despite this lively discourse, the decisions were ultimately made by a small elite group. The reality of Greek democracy was that it was far from the egalitarian utopia we often imagine. As you navigate the crowded agora, dodging merchants and philosophers alike, you can't help but notice the less than ideal living conditions. Hygiene took a back seat to convenience, and sanitation systems were about as advanced as a Stone Age toothbrush. The streets were narrow, winding, and often filled with waste. Public baths were available, but they were a luxury for many. Let's just say that body odor was more prevalent than political discourse. So, as the sun begins to dip and the shadows grow long, you leave the agora with a head full of ideas and a bag slightly lighter in drachmas. You've seen the social intricacies, the economic divides, and the political realities of ancient Athens. And while the myth of a perfect democracy may have taken a hit, the allure of the agora as the beating heart of the city remains undeniable. As you make your way back home, you carry with you the vibrant chaos of Athenian life, a reminder that even in the cradle of democracy, life was anything but simple. Keep those sandals handy because tomorrow promises another day in the ever-turning wheel of Greek history. As you leave the bustling agora behind, the cacophony of merchants and philosophers fades, replaced by the more subdued rhythm of domestic life. Welcome to ancient Greek home life, where the ideal family unit was less of a Greek tragedy and more of a Greek comedy. Let's peel back the layers of myth and peek into the daily grind behind those iconic Doric columns. First up, gender roles. In a society famous for its thinkers, you'd expect some progressive ideas about gender equality, right? Wrong. While men were out philosophizing and politicking, women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and by confined, I mean as restricted as a toga at a Roman banquet. Athenian women managed the household, raised children, and spun thread, a job as tedious as watching paint dry, but essential for clothing the family. For these women, the concept of public lives was as foreign as a Spartan delicacy. They were expected to stay indoors, managing the oikos, the household. Think of the oikos as the ancient Greek version of a modern CEO role, except with zero salary, no board meetings, and absolutely no chance of a promotion. The only board they were dealing with was the one they used to beat dust out of rugs. Daughters were groomed for marriage, which happened around the tender age of 14. Yes, you heard that right. 14. A time in life when today's teens are busy mastering TikTok dances, these young women were preparing to become wives and mothers. Once married, a woman's world was largely confined to the home. Her influence, while significant within the domestic sphere, was as invisible in the public eye as a ghost at noon. Now, let's debunk the myth of the idyllic Greek home. Picture a grand, sprawling villa with marble floors and intricate mosaics. Got it? Great. Now toss that image out the window. The average Athenian house was more practical than palatial, built from mud bricks and wood. These homes were modest, typically 1 or 2 stories, with rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard was the heart of the home, serving as a space for cooking, socializing, and catching the occasional breeze. Think less, grand estate, and more cozy cottage. The layout was simple, a few rooms for sleeping, a kitchen, and the andron, a men-only space for entertaining guests. And by guests, I mean other men. Women weren't allowed in the andron during symposia, those famous drinking parties where philosophical debates flowed as freely as the wine. The andron was the man cave of ancient Greece, complete with couches for lounging and a crater for mixing wine. It was a sanctuary of sorts, but one that doubled as a stage for male bonding rituals. The walls of these homes were often unadorned, save for the occasional painted decoration. Floors were typically packed earth with rugs and mats to keep things cozy. Windows were small and placed high up, more for security than for a view. The Greeks might have been masters of sculpture and pottery, but their homes were about as plain as a Spartan's diet. Now, about that ideal family unit, a concept as slippery as an eel in olive oil. The typical family comprised the kyrios, or male head of the household, his wife, children, and possibly a few slaves. The kyrios wielded absolute authority within the home, making decisions on everything from finances to marriage arrangements. His role was akin to a modern-day CEO, except he was less likely to be ousted by a board and more likely to rule until his last breath. Children were expected to learn the ropes of their respective roles from a young age. Boys were groomed to take over the family affairs, while girls were trained in domestic duties. The education of boys included reading, writing, and arithmetic. Basically, the ancient Greek version of a prep school curriculum. They also learned music and gymnastics, preparing them for civic life. Girls, on the other hand, were taught household management, which doesn't quite have the same ring as philosopher. Let's not forget the role of slaves within the household. They were the silent workforce, tending to chores, assisting with childcare, and even participating in family rituals. Despite their crucial role, they were as nameless in historical records as a chorus member in a Greek play. Owned by the family, their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters, a stark reminder of the societal hierarchy of the time. Economically, the household was a self-sustaining unit, producing much of what it needed. However, trade and commerce were still vital. The family relied on the agora for goods they couldn't produce themselves. This included everything from olive oil and wine to more luxurious items like imported spices and textiles. The household economy was a delicate balance, one that could be easily disrupted by poor harvests or political strife. In terms of social dynamics, the household was a microcosm of the larger city-state. It mirrored the societal values and hierarchies, with the kyrios at the top, the wife and children below, and slaves at the bottom. This structure reinforced the broader social order, where power and privilege were concentrated in the hands of a few. Now, let's talk about the romanticized image of the Greek philosopher lounging in his courtyard, pondering the mysteries of the universe. While there were certainly philosophers among the citizenry, the average Athenian was more concerned with putting food on the table than pondering the meaning of life. The philosophical pursuits we celebrate today were luxuries afforded to those with the time and means. For the rest, life was a series of daily tasks and responsibilities with little room for existential musings. As you settle into the rhythm of domestic life, remember that the simplicity of the Greek home masked a complex web of relationships and responsibilities. The idealized family unit was more a reflection of societal expectations than a reality for many. Behind the scenes, women and slaves played vital roles in maintaining the household, even if their contributions were often overlooked by the annals of history. So, as you sit in the courtyard, listening to the distant hum of the city, you can't help but marvel at the intricate dance of ancient Greek life. From the bustling agora to the quiet confines of the home, each day was a testament to human resilience and adaptability. And while the myth of the idyllic Greek family might crumble under scrutiny, the reality is no less fascinating. It's a reminder that history is as much about the untold stories as it is about the legends. Tomorrow, we'll delve deeper into the lives of those who lived in the shadows of history, exploring the unseen networks that held Greek society together. But for now, enjoy the evening calm and the knowledge that even in ancient times, life was a series of balancing acts, each as precarious and unpredictable as the next. As the evening calm settles over Athens, let's pivot to the intellectual and cultural high-wire act that is education and entertainment in ancient Greece. Picture a world where education is less of a right and more of a privilege. With a curriculum so skewed, it makes modern standardized tests look like a democratic utopia. In this era, the classroom is a battleground of class and gender hierarchy, where boys and girls learn vastly different lessons, literally and metaphorically. First, let's talk about the boys, those lucky heirs to the Athenian intellectual tradition. While the average Athenian child might be more preoccupied with dodging chores than pondering the Pythagorean theorem, boys from well-to-do families were groomed to become the future Socrateses and Platos of the world. These boys started their education around the ripe old age of 7, attending schools where they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and a bit of music, because what's a future statesman without the ability to strum a lyre? These schools weren't the sprawling, ivy-covered campuses of today. Instead, imagine a small room with a group of boys huddled around a teacher who might just be the sternest man to ever wield a wax tablet. The cost of this education? About a drachma a day, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that's roughly the daily wage of a skilled labourer. So, yeah, not exactly pocket change. And while we're on the subject of pricey education, let's debunk the myth that every Athenian boy was a budding philosopher king. Reality check, most were more likely to inherit the family trade than a seat in the Areopagus. Only the elite could afford to send their sons to study under renowned philosophers, where they'd ponder life's big questions between sips of diluted wine. For the rest, education was a practical affair, learning the skills needed to keep the family business afloat. Now, while boys were busy becoming the next great orators, girls were learning a different kind of lesson. Their education took place within the confines of the home, focusing on practical skills like weaving, cooking, and managing the household. Think of it as a crash course in domestic survival, with no electives and no graduation ceremony. The curriculum was as thrilling as watching the agora at dawn. But let's not dismiss this homebound syllabus entirely. These skills were crucial for a girl's future role as the mistress of her own oikos. In a society where marriages were arranged and dowries were as necessary as a good olive harvest, these domestic arts were a girl's ticket to social stability. It's a harsh reality that while boys were being prepped for public life, girls were being readied for a lifetime of domesticity. Now, before you think ancient Greece was all work and no play, let's dive into the realm of sports and theatre, two cultural pillars that offered a break from the daily grind. First up, sports. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with athletic prowess, as evidenced by the Olympic Games. Held every 4 years in Olympia starting in 776 BCE, these games were a blend of athletic competition and religious festival, drawing competitors from across the Greek world. But hold your laurel wreaths, because the reality of these games is less Olympic glory and more ancient reality TV. Far from today's inclusive sporting extravaganzas, the Olympics were a male-only affair. Women were banned from even watching, under penalty of death. an extreme measure that makes today's nosebleed seats seem like a luxury suite. The events themselves were a mix of running, wrestling, and chariot racing, with participants competing nude. Yes, you heard that right, nude. Because why not add a little extra challenge to your 200-metre dash? The games were not just about personal glory, though. Winning athletes were seen as heroes, bringing honour to their city-states. They received free meals for life and front-row seats at public events, perks that would have any modern athlete green with envy. But beneath the glory, the games were also a battleground for city-state rivalries, with the competition as much about politics as it was about athletics. Now, let's take a detour from the dusty fields of Olympia to the grand theatres of Athens. The birthplace of drama, these theatres were less about entertainment and more about civic duty. Tragedies and comedies were performed during festivals like the city Dionysia, where citizens gathered to watch tales of gods, heroes, and the occasional farcical satire play out on stage. But before we get carried away with visions of a golden age of drama, let me burst that bubble. Theatres were open-air arenas, and the seating was as comfortable as a bed of rocks. Literally. Audience members sat on stone benches, exposed to the elements and whatever the neighbour next to them had for lunch. Forget cushioned seats and air conditioning, this was theatre for the rugged soul. Despite the hardships, theatre was a social equaliser, at least for male citizens. Everyone from the wealthiest aristocrat to the poorest labourer could attend. It was a moment where class lines blurred, if only for a few hours. Yet, like everything else in ancient Greece, this equality had its limits. Women were again spectators in absentia, barred from performing and often from attending. The irony is palpable. An art form celebrated for exploring human nature, yet excluding half the population from participating. Now, let's tackle the myth that theatre was all highbrow art and lofty themes. Sure, tragedies tackled profound questions of fate and morality, but comedies were a different beast altogether. With plots that were as bawdy and irreverent as a toga party gone awry, comedic plays lampooned everything from politicians to the gods themselves. Aristophanes, the Shakespeare of slapstick, was notorious for his sharp wit and willingness to poke fun at the establishment. Imagine Saturday Night Live, but with more togas and fewer commercial breaks. As the afternoon sun dips lower, casting long shadows over Athens, it's clear that education and entertainment in ancient Greece were complex tapestries woven from the threads of class, gender, and ambition. The myths of an enlightened society crumble when faced with the gritty reality of who had access to knowledge and culture. Education was a privilege, sports were a spectacle, and theatre was both a mirror and a mask for society's truths. So, as you wander back through the agora, dodging merchants and the occasional philosopher, remember that the story of ancient Greece is as layered as the city itself. The ideals of learning and leisure were as much about status and power as they were about enlightenment and enjoyment. And while the myths of intellectual and cultural superiority may persist, the reality was as nuanced and contradictory as the human condition itself. As the day draws to a close, you're left with the knowledge that the world of ancient Greece, for all its beauty and brilliance, was a place of stark contrasts and complex truths. Tomorrow, we'll delve even deeper into the heart of this ancient society, exploring the unseen networks that held it together and the stories that remain untold. Until then, take a moment to appreciate the intricate dance of history, a dance that continues to shape our world today. As the sun sets over ancient Athens, you might think the city is finally winding down. But don't be fooled. This is just the calm before the storm of political intrigue and military obligation that defined Greek life. Forget the romanticized vision of the warrior citizen standing valiantly against the tide of invaders. The reality? A bit more like a mandatory potluck where everyone's expected to bring their best dish, or in this case, their best spear. Let's kick things off with a reality check about the so-called citizen soldiers. The hoplite, the backbone of Greek infantry, was not just a soldier, but a taxpayer in armour. The cost of equipping oneself as a hoplite could run as high as 30 drachmas, a sum that didn't exactly grow on olive trees. For context, that's about a month's wages for a skilled craftsman. So while we picture valiant defenders of democracy, remember that these warriors were also footing their bill for the privilege of defending their city. But why the demand for such a military-ready populace? Welcome to the Greek world of constant tension and war. These city-states weren't just playing ancient Risk, They were living it. Between the Persian invasions and the Peloponnesian War, a Greek city-state without a formidable military was about as safe as a toga at a toga party. And let's not forget the naval arms race. Athens, with its fleet of triremes, was the maritime powerhouse. Each trireme cost about a talent of silver to build and maintain, roughly 6,000 drachmas. Talk about a financial sinkhole, but it was a necessary one to keep trade routes open and rivals at bay. Now, let's not gloss over the personal sacrifices involved. The life of a soldier was grueling, with training that started in childhood. Spartan boys, for example, were tossed into the Agogia at the age of 7, where they learned the fine art of not dying in battle. Imagine a boot camp that lasts until you're 20. Athens, meanwhile, prided itself on its citizen army, but military service was compulsory. And by compulsory, I mean you had about as much choice as a fish in a net. The economic impact was substantial too. While the wealthy might afford to pay others to serve in their place, the average citizen had to drop the plough and pick up a spear, leaving farms and businesses to languish. Wars were as much about economic strain as they were about glory and honour. The Peloponnesian War, for instance, dragged on for nearly 3 decades, leaving Athens economically exhausted and politically fractured. It was less of a heroic epic and more of an ancient soap opera with a particularly tragic ending. Now, if we're pulling back the curtain on myths, let's talk about Sparta. Sparta, the ultimate warrior society, or so the legend goes. In reality, Spartan life was a rigid affair with a social hierarchy as unforgiving as a Spartan drill sergeant. The Helots, essentially serfs who outnumbered the Spartans, did the agricultural heavy lifting while the Spartan men trained for war. It was a society built on the backs of the oppressed, not exactly the glorious simplicity we imagine. The Spartan military might was indeed formidable, but it came at a cost. The constant threat of revolt by the Helots meant that Sparta was as much a police state as a military juggernaut. The famed Spartan discipline was born out of necessity, not choice, and their society was as brittle as it was strong. While the image of Spartan warriors is awe-inspiring, the reality was an uneasy balance between domination and fear. Meanwhile, Athens championed its naval prowess. The Athenian fleet was the envy of the Mediterranean, and its sailors were the unsung heroes of Athenian democracy. But maintaining such a fleet required resources that often came at the expense of the city's poorer citizens. The rowers, largely drawn from the lower classes, were paid a modest wage, but the wealth generated by Athens' maritime empire rarely trickled down to those pulling the oars. This brings us to the broader political landscape. The city-states of Greece were in a perpetual state of competition, their alliances as fleeting as the Greek summer. The Delian League, led by Athens, was as much about securing tribute from its allies as it was about defence against Persia, and when those allies revolted, Athens was quick to reassert control, sometimes ruthlessly. The veneer of Athenian democracy didn't extend beyond its borders, where imperial ambitions cast long shadows. Yet, for all the strife and struggle, Greek culture has left an indelible mark on history. The philosophical inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have shaped Western thought, while Greek art and architecture set standards that still inspire today. The Parthenon stands as a testament to human creativity and the complexities of Athenian society. It's a legacy built on contradictions, where great achievements coexisted with profound inequalities. As we wrap up our historical journey, it's crucial to recognize the dual nature of the Greek legacy. It's a story of brilliance and brutality, of high ideals and harsh realities. The myths we love to tell about ancient Greece are captivating, but the truth is even more compelling. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of stories, but a rich tapestry of human experience, complex, flawed, and endlessly fascinating. So, as you drift off into the realm of Morpheus, remember that the ancient Greeks, for all their quirks and contradictions, were a lot like us. They grappled with the challenges of their time, striving for greatness while wrestling with their limitations. It's a legacy that invites us to reflect on our own world, to marvel at what has been achieved, and to ponder what still remains to be done. Sleep well, knowing you've taken a step closer to understanding the ancient world and, perhaps, our own. In the land down under, where kangaroos and koalas steal the spotlight, there's a lesser-known marvel, the ancient medical practices of Australia's Aboriginal peoples. Now, before you conjure up images of mystical chants and dreamtime fairy tales, let's get one thing straight. Aboriginal traditional medicine is as real as the rocks in Uluru, and twice as grounded. We're talking about a system that's been road-tested over tens of thousands of years, like a prehistoric version of Consumer Reports, but for survival. So, what is Aboriginal traditional medicine? It's a rich tapestry of healing practices developed by the original inhabitants of Australia, meticulously woven across 250 distinct language groups. That's right, not just a couple of tribes, but 250. That's more diversity than an international potluck dinner. And each group, spread across this vast continent, had its own unique take on what made a person tick, and more importantly, what made them untick. The beauty of these practices lies in their adaptability. The Noongar people of southwestern Australia, for instance, relied heavily on the Mari gum tree. They'd harvest its bark not just for its Pinterest-worthy aesthetic, but for its antiseptic qualities, making it the neosporin of the bush. Meanwhile, up in the tropical north, the Yolngu people were concocting brews from the leaves of the tea tree, long before it became a staple in overpriced shampoos and lotions. But let's not get too starry-eyed just yet. While the romanticized notion of a mystical healer waving eucalyptus leaves over the sick is captivating, it misses the point. These practices weren't about magic, they were about empirical evidence. Aboriginal healers, often called Ingunkari in Central Australia, were the original scientists, collecting data the old-fashioned way through generations of observation, trial, and sometimes error. When your dataset spans millennia, you tend to get pretty good at separating fact from fiction. This brings us to a common misconception, that Aboriginal medicine was all smoke and mirrors. In reality, it was more about the smoke and less about the mirrors. Take smoke ceremonies, a classic example. Sure, they had spiritual significance, but the smoke also acted as a pretty effective insect repellent. Mosquitoes be gone. And let's not forget the use of fire to manage the land, a practice that not only shaped the landscape, but also helped prevent disease by controlling mosquito populations and promoting the growth of medicinal plants. The effectiveness of these practices was no accident. It was the result of a deep understanding of their environment. Aboriginal people knew their land like a Netflix addict knows their favorite series, every twist, turn, and hidden Easter egg. They could identify illnesses by observing the behavior of animals or changes in the weather. This level of expertise would make even the most seasoned meteorologist feel like a weather intern. Now, why does this all matter? Well, for one, it challenges the stereotype of indigenous cultures as static and unchanging. Far from it, Aboriginal societies were dynamic and innovative, constantly adapting their methods to suit their needs. This adaptability was crucial for survival in a land as diverse as Australia, where ecosystems range from arid deserts to lush rainforests. Moreover, it highlights the importance of preserving these traditional practices. In an era where modern medicine is king, it's easy to dismiss ancient knowledge as obsolete. But as we face global challenges like antibiotic resistance and climate change, the insights from these age-old practices could offer invaluable solutions. Imagine a world where we combine the precision of modern science with the wisdom of ancient traditions. It's a healthcare revolution just waiting to happen. In the end, Aboriginal traditional medicine isn't just an historical curiosity, it's a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. So next time someone dismisses these practices as mere folklore, remind them of the time-tested effectiveness embedded in each remedy, learned through centuries of careful observation and adaptation. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, especially when it's been working for over 60,000 years. So, let's take a detour from the big picture and dive into the nitty-gritty of plant-based remedies that might just make your modern medicine cabinet look like a relic from the Dark Ages. First up, we have the eucalyptus tree, Australia's leafy gift to the world that's more versatile than a Swiss Army knife. While European settlers were busy trying to figure out how to turn eucalyptus leaves into something a bit more exciting than a cup of tea, Aboriginal Australians were already a few centuries ahead, using its oil as a decongestant long before anyone heard of Vicks Vapor Rub. This wasn't just some placebo effect cooked up around a bushfire, it was science, bush style. The antiseptic properties of eucalyptus oil were documented as early as the 18th century. In 1770, When Captain James Cook landed on Australian shores, his crew were suffering from scurvy, while Aboriginal communities were likely wondering why these newcomers didn't just reach for the local flora. It was only when the Europeans stopped scratching their heads long enough to take notes that the real genius of Aboriginal medicine began to be appreciated. By the 1850s, eucalyptus oil was being distilled and exported to Europe, making it Australia's first significant export. Imagine that! A homegrown remedy going global before Instagram influencers made anything viral. But let's not pretend that Europeans were quick to embrace Aboriginal wisdom. The process was more like a slow-motion car crash, with settlers oscillating between fascination and downright bafflement. These newcomers were like kids trying to figure out a Rubik's Cube, all thumbs and no clue. They were intrigued by the Aboriginal healers, some even calling them doctors in their journals, but struggled to understand the underlying principles. Their approach was akin to trying to read Shakespeare in Klingon, lots of squinting, very little comprehension. However, the allure of the eucalyptus was undeniable. It wasn't just the promise of clearer sinuses, it also had the potential to line pockets. By 1860, eucalyptus oil was being sold in London, marketed as a wonder cure for everything from colds to the common hangover. The economic impact was significant. An early example of bioprospecting, if you will, where the traditional knowledge of indigenous people was commodified for European gain. Yet, despite the newfound commercial frenzy, many settlers still viewed Aboriginal medicine as nothing more than quaint folklore. It's the classic tale of appropriation without appreciation, a theme as persistent as the common cold itself. But eucalyptus wasn't the only plant making waves. Take the tea tree, for instance. Before it became the darling of natural skincare products, it was used by the Bundjalung people of eastern Australia for its antimicrobial properties. European settlers took note, eventually leading to its commercial production in the 1920s. The economic stakes were high. By the 1940s, tea tree oil was considered more valuable than gold by the Australian Army during World War II, thanks to its effectiveness in treating wounds and preventing infection. Now that's a twist worthy of a Hollywood plot, if Hollywood were more interested in historical accuracy than explosions. Here's another fascinating tidbit, the quandong, a bright red fruit that looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. Aboriginal Australians used it for its nutritional and medicinal properties long before it became the darling of gourmet chefs in fancy Sydney restaurants. The seeds were ground into a paste to treat arthritis, while the fruit itself is rich in vitamin C, perfect for keeping scurvy at bay, something Cook's crew could have definitely used. European settlers were often awed by the depth of botanical knowledge possessed by Aboriginal people. But let's be real, they were also more than a little sceptical. This skepticism was partly due to the cultural chasm that existed at the time. The settlers' scientific mindset clashed with the holistic approach of Aboriginal medicine, which integrated spiritual and physical healing. The result? A lot of raised eyebrows and missed opportunities for collaboration. That's not to say there weren't moments of mutual understanding. By the late 19th century, European botanists began acknowledging the effectiveness of Aboriginal remedies. Some settlers even recorded Aboriginal names for plants in their journals, a nod to the rich ecological knowledge held by the land's original inhabitants. This was an early form of cross-cultural exchange, albeit one marked by unequal power dynamics and a fair bit of cultural blind spots. Yet, for all the intrigue and economic potential, the adoption of Aboriginal remedies by Europeans was sporadic at best. It was like trying to catch water in a sieve. Some knowledge slipped through, but much of it was lost to indifference or outright dismissal. The Europeans' attempts to understand Aboriginal medicine often ended up being more about their own misconceptions than the actual practices. Imagine trying to decode a foreign language by just guessing. Inevitably, some things got lost in translation. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Aboriginal plant-based remedies is undeniable. They've left a lasting imprint, not just on the Australian landscape, but on the world stage. Eucalyptus and tea tree oils are now household names, found in everything from cleaning products to skincare. It's a bittersweet success story, though, highlighting both the resilience of Aboriginal knowledge and the complex dynamics of cultural exchange. As we continue to peel back the layers of this history, it's crucial to recognise the enduring contributions of Aboriginal medicine. Their traditional practices offer insights that are more relevant now than ever, especially as we grapple with modern medical challenges. In a world where pharmaceutical companies race to patent the next big thing, Maybe the answer lies in revisiting the wisdom of the past. After all, if it's been working for 60,000 years, it might just be worth a second look. So, as we stand at the intersection of modern medicine marvels and ancient wisdom, it's time to turn our gaze from the plants that made Aboriginal medicine famous to the people who wielded them with the finesse of a master chef. Enter the Ngangkari, the traditional healers of Central Australia, who were basically the Swiss Army knives of their communities. They weren't just patching up wounds or mixing herbal concoctions. They were the original multitaskers, acting as doctors, therapists, spiritual guides and, let's face it, probably the village gossip columnists all in one. Now, before you start imagining these healers as mystical figures waving wands and chanting incantations, let's get one thing straight. Their work was as much about science as it was about spirituality. They were the OG practitioners of what we'd now call holistic healthcare, focusing on the mind, body and spirit long before it was trendy. And let's be honest, they were doing this without the help of Google or a Harvard degree, which makes their expertise all the more impressive. The Ngangkari had a reputation that would make any modern influencer green with envy. They were revered, their skills passed down through generations, like a family recipe for the perfect sourdough. This isn't just anecdotal, it's backed by centuries of practice and observation. They were trained from a young age, often hand-picked by older healers who spotted their potential. Think of it as the Hogwarts of healing, minus the sorting hat and with a lot more sand and sunburn. While Western medicine was just getting its act together with the germ theory in the 19th century, Ngangkari were already diagnosing ailments by observing behavioral changes in people and animals or shifts in the natural environment. Their methods were empirical, not mystical, more akin to Sherlock Holmes than Merlin. They understood the interconnectedness of life and the land, a concept that modern medicine is only now beginning to appreciate. But here's where the plot thickens. When European colonizers rocked up on Australian shores, they had about as much understanding of Aboriginal health practices as a goldfish has of quantum physics. To them, the Ngangkari were little more than witch doctors, a term dripping with ignorance and a lack of appreciation for the complex role these healers played. This narrative wasn't just a casual oversight, it was a deliberate dismissal, rooted in a colonial mindset that viewed anything non-European as inferior or backward. This disdain wasn't just a matter of semantics. It had real consequences, affecting how Aboriginal health practices were perceived and integrated, or not, into the broader medical landscape. The colonial authorities often banned traditional practices, labelling them as pagan or superstitious. In doing so, they overlooked the rich tapestry of knowledge that these healers brought to the table. Knowledge that could have enriched and informed Western practices had there been a little more curiosity and a little less arrogance. The irony is palpable. While the colonial doctors were busy bleeding their patients and prescribing mercury for ailments, treatments that, unsurprisingly, had a tendency to make things worse, the Ngangkari were practicing forms of care that modern medicine would eventually rediscover. Practices like psychological counselling, stress relief through environmental immersion, and even early forms of physiotherapy were all part of their repertoire. It's as if the colonizers walked past a treasure chest of healthcare wisdom and decided to pick up the sand instead. And yet, despite the dismissal by colonial narratives, the Ngangkari persisted. They continued to serve their communities, adapting their methods to survive the onslaught of change that colonization brought. They moved between worlds, navigating the demands of their own people while dealing with the encroaching Western systems. Talk about a juggling act. It's a testament to their resilience and adaptability, not to mention their sheer tenacity. The legacy of the Ngangkari is not just one of survival, but of influence. As the 20th century rolled on, there was a slow but growing recognition of the value these healers brought. By the late 1990s, Ngangkari began to be formally recognised within the Australian healthcare system. Hospitals and clinics in Central Australia started employing them, not as relics of a bygone era, but as valuable contributors to modern healthcare. It was a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide was turning. These days, the Ngangkari are celebrated for their contributions, their expertise sought after by health professionals, eager to understand the holistic approach that Western medicine is still struggling to fully embrace. It's a recognition that's long overdue, but it's also a reminder of what was lost in the rush to dismiss Aboriginal practices. in the end, the story of the Ungankari is one of redemption and recognition. It's a story that challenges us to rethink what we know about healthcare and who gets to define it. It's a tale that beckons us to look beyond the surface and see the depth of wisdom that ancient practices hold. And as we move forward, it's a story that invites us to blend the best of both worlds. Modern medicine's precision with the Ngangani's holistic vision to create a healthcare system that truly serves everyone. So, as we continue to explore the fascinating world of Aboriginal medicine, let's remember the Ungankari, the unsung heroes of healthcare whose influence is finally getting the spotlight it deserves. Because, in the words of every great storyteller, this is just the beginning. Stay tuned as we delve further into the ancient practices that continue to shape our world today. As the spotlight finally turns to the Ngangkari, it's time to face the glaring elephant in the historical room, the arrival of British colonists and their impact on Aboriginal medicine. Picture this. A clash of cultures so profound, it makes your average soap opera feud look like a polite disagreement over tea. And speaking of tea, the Brits brought plenty of that along with a heap of medical practices that were about as effective as a chocolate teapot in the outback sun. The British colonists, arriving in the late 18th century, were armed with a bundle of medical practices that they considered the pinnacle of civilized healthcare. Picture a collection of treatments that included bloodletting, purging, and dosing patients with mercury. Yes, mercury. You know, that shiny liquid metal that's now more at home in a thermometer than in your medicine cabinet. If the colonists were the Avengers, their superpower would have been turning mild ailments into major health crises. To be fair, medicine in the 18th century was a bit like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, only with more leeches and fewer carbs. The colonists, convinced of their medical superiority, largely ignored Aboriginal practices, dismissing them as primitive or superstitious. They couldn't have been more wrong if they'd tried solving calculus with a crayon. Ironically, while the colonizers were busy undermining Aboriginal knowledge, they were also inadvertently showcasing the flaws in their own medical system. Economic motivations played a hefty role in this dismissal. The British Empire wasn't exactly known for its cultural sensitivity. It was more of a my way or the highway kind of deal. Incorporating Aboriginal medicine might have been seen as an admission of inadequacy, a sign that the empire's glowing reputation had a few cracks. Moreover, the colonists were in the business of expansion, not integration. They prioritized establishing trade routes and resource extraction over cultural exchange. It was less about what could be learned and more about what could be taken: land, resources, and, if they had their way, the very identity of a people. To add insult to injury, British medical practices were often economically driven. The burgeoning pharmaceutical industry of the time was eager to find new markets and products. The idea of promoting indigenous remedies, which couldn't be patented or easily commercialized, was about as appealing to them as a lead balloon. After all, you can't exactly slap a trademark on a gum tree. Yet, despite the colonial clumsiness, Aboriginal practices didn't just roll over and die. They persisted, often in subtle, resilient forms. Aboriginal communities continue to pass down their medical knowledge in secret, whispering the wisdom of their ancestors under the watchful eyes of those who sought to erase it. In some cases, Aboriginal healers worked alongside colonial doctors, sharing insights on local plants and treatments. These moments of collaboration, though rare, were like finding a needle in a haystack, brief but valuable. The persistence of Aboriginal medicine was also fueled by necessity. The harsh Australian landscape required practical solutions, and the colonists soon discovered that some of their remedies were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. When European livestock started dropping like flies due to local diseases, guess who had the answers? Yep, the Aboriginal communities who had been managing the land and its challenges for millennia. And if you need a concrete example of colonial medical folly, look no further than the smallpox epidemic of the late 1700s. The disease, brought over by the colonists, decimated Aboriginal populations. But while British doctors were fumbling with ineffective treatments, Aboriginal healers were employing quarantine measures and herbal remedies to combat the spread. Their understanding of disease prevention might not have been written in Latin, but it was effective, a testament to their deep-rooted knowledge of the land and its inhabitants. Despite the pressures of colonization, Aboriginal medicine wasn't just a relic to be preserved in dusty books. It evolved, adapting to the changing circumstances. New plants were tested, new methods developed, all while maintaining the core principles that had sustained them for generations. This adaptability was crucial for their survival in a world that seemed hell-bent on erasing their existence. The economic and political motivations behind the sidelining of Aboriginal medicine were clear. Yet, the resilience of these practices speaks to a deeper truth. You can't squash wisdom that's been cultivated over tens of thousands of years with a wave of colonial arrogance. That's like trying to put out a bushfire with a garden hose. It's just not going to work. As we continue this journey through the annals of history, it's crucial to recognise the enduring impact of colonisation on Aboriginal medicine. The story isn't just about what was lost or ignored, but also about the remarkable persistence of knowledge that refused to be extinguished. It's a narrative that challenges us to reconsider not just the past, but how we approach the future of healthcare. A future that could be much richer if it embraces the lessons of both modern science and ancient wisdom. So, as we leave this chapter open-ended, ready for the next twist in the tale, remember this. The history of medicine is as much about the stories we choose to tell as it is about the ones we ignore. And in the case of Aboriginal medicine, it's a story that's far from over. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this fascinating saga, where each new discovery is a reminder that the past is never truly past. It's just waiting for us to catch up. As we sail into the 21st century, the legacy of Aboriginal medicine is no longer just a footnote in history textbooks. It's a vivid chapter that's still being written as traditional knowledge steps into the limelight alongside modern science. This isn't some quaint throwback to yesteryear, it's a full-fledged collaboration, like Batman teaming up with Iron Man, unlikely allies with a shared mission to save the day. Take the Ngangkari, for instance. These traditional healers are now rubbing shoulders with medical professionals in clinics across Australia, particularly in places like the NPY, Inganyatjara, Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara lands. Here, the Ngangkari work alongside doctors to provide holistic care that addresses both the physical and spiritual needs of their patients. This partnership is like a beautifully orchestrated duet where ancient chants harmonise with the beeps of modern medical devices. The recognition of Aboriginal healing practices isn't just confined to remote areas. In 2008, South Australia's Health Department made a groundbreaking move by officially recognising the Ngangkari as part of their health workforce. Now, that's a plot twist worthy of a standing ovation. Not only did this elevate the status of traditional healers, but it also opened up new avenues for cultural exchange and mutual respect. The economic implications of this recognition are significant. By integrating Aboriginal medicine into the mainstream healthcare system, there's potential for cost savings and improved patient outcomes. A study published in the Medical Journal of Australia in 2015 found that incorporating traditional healing practices could reduce healthcare costs by addressing the root causes of illness rather than just the symptoms. It's like fixing a leaky roof instead of just placing buckets to catch the drips. But this isn't just about economics, it's about justice. For too long, Aboriginal knowledge was sidelined, its practitioners marginalised. Now the tide is turning and there's a growing acknowledgement of the value that traditional practices bring to the table. In fact, in 2017, the Australian government launched the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan, which explicitly recognised the role of traditional medicine in closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous health outcomes. It's a small step, but in the right direction, like finally getting the GPS to work after driving in circles for hours. One shining example of this collaborative spirit is the Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin. Here, researchers work hand in hand with Aboriginal communities to explore the medicinal properties of native plants. They've already identified several promising compounds with potential applications in pharmaceuticals. It's science with a side of cultural appreciation, a refreshing change from the colonial attitude of take first, ask questions later. Speaking of plants, let's not forget the burgeoning bush medicine industry. Companies like Bush Medicina, an Indigenous-owned enterprise in the Northern Territory, are bringing traditional remedies to a global audience. From Kakadu plum face cream to wild rosella hair oil, these products are flying off the shelves faster than you can say organic. And the economic benefits are substantial, providing jobs and income for remote communities. It's capitalism with a conscience, a rare beast indeed. Of course, this renaissance of Aboriginal medicine isn't without its challenges. Cultural appropriation remains a thorny issue. There's a fine line between appreciating and exploiting traditional knowledge, and not everyone walks it gracefully. Some companies have been accused of profiting from Aboriginal remedies without giving due credit or compensation to the communities that created them. It's a reminder that the path to reconciliation is paved with good intentions and the occasional pothole of greed. But let's not end on a sour note. The resurgence of Aboriginal medicine is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of Indigenous cultures. It's a reminder that the old ways still have much to teach us, especially in a world facing new challenges like antibiotic resistance and chronic disease. By embracing the wisdom of the past, we can forge a future where traditional and modern medicine coexist, each enriching the other. As we wrap up this journey through the annals of Aboriginal medicine, let's pause to reflect on what we've learned. These practices aren't dusty relics of a bygone era. They're vibrant, living traditions that continue to evolve and adapt. They're a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring power of knowledge passed down through generations. And as we look to the future, let's remember the words of the Ngangkari, who remind us that healing isn't just about curing disease, it's about restoring balance within ourselves and with the world around us. So, next time you reach for that bottle of tea tree oil or eucalyptus balm, take a moment to appreciate the rich tapestry of history and culture that brought it to your medicine cabinet. Because in the end, the story of Aboriginal medicine isn't just about plants and potions. It's about people, their stories, and the timeless quest to understand the world and our place within it. And that's a narrative worth preserving, celebrating, and continuing for generations to come. If you've ever wondered why the ancient world was so obsessed with the colour purple, and no, not the Oprah movie, then you're in for a treat. Or perhaps more accurately, an aromatic experience that's best appreciated from a safe distance. Our story kicks off in the bustling, ancient city-states of Tyre and Sidon, nestled along the Mediterranean coastline of what is today Lebanon. These were the powerhouses of the Phoenician civilization, a society that managed to turn snail snot into economic gold. Yes, you heard that right, snail snot. The secret ingredient to their success was the murex snail, a humble sea creature whose claim to fame was its ability to produce a tiny bit of purple dye. And I mean tiny. It took about 10,000 of these little guys just to colour a single toga. That's right, one toga. Imagine the sight and smell of all those snails being harvested and processed. If you think your job stinks, try being an ancient Phoenician dye worker. The dye itself wasn't just any purple. It was the epitome of luxury and exclusivity. This wasn't a colour you'd find in your average ancient wardrobe. We're talking about Tyrian purple, a shade so rich and vibrant that it screamed wealth and power. It was the kind of colour that would make you stand out in a crowd, which was exactly the point. In a world without Instagram, your toga was your status update. The process of extracting this dye was as delightful as it sounds. Workers would collect the murex snails, crack open their shells, and carefully extract a tiny gland that contained the precious liquid. This was then left to ferment, yes, really, producing an odour that could only be described as a cross between rotten fish and old socks. But hey, all that mattered was the end product, an intoxicatingly beautiful dye that could fetch a king's ransom. And fetch it did. The Phoenicians were master traders, and they knew a good thing when they smelled it, literally. They turned the Smelly enterprise into a booming industry with Tyre and Sidon at its epicenter. For them, this dye wasn't just a product, it was a ticket to economic and political clout. The Phoenician ships, laden with jars of this purple gold, crisscrossed the Mediterranean, spreading their influence far and wide. What's fascinating is how this little snail and its vibrant secretion became a symbol of power across empires. From the robes of Roman emperors to the priestly garments in ancient Judea, Tyrian purple became synonymous with authority. It was a colour that transcended borders, a unifying thread in the patchwork of ancient societies. The economic motivations behind this were clear. The dye was incredibly labour-intensive to produce, and its scarcity made it a luxury item. The Phoenicians essentially had a monopoly on purple, and they milked it for all it was worth. This exclusivity made the dye a tool of the elite, a way to signal wealth and command respect without uttering a single word. In the grand tapestry of history, the Phoenicians were the master weavers. They understood the power of perception and the allure of exclusivity. By controlling the production and distribution of Tyrian purple, they secured their place in the annals of economic history. Their maritime prowess wasn't just about exploration. It was about creating a network of trade that linked disparate cultures and economies, all tied together by the colour purple. While today we might take the availability of colour for granted, in the ancient world, each hue carried weight and significance. Tyrian purple was more than just a dye. It was a statement, a declaration of power and prestige, and all thanks to a little snail that probably had no idea it was about to become a cornerstone of ancient commerce. So next time you see anything purple, spare a thought for the Phoenicians and their smelly yet lucrative legacy. They turned an unlikely source into an empire-spanning phenomenon, proving that sometimes the most unlikely things can hold the greatest power. Now, as the vibrant purple threads of our tale weave into the grander fabric of Mediterranean trade, let's talk about how this snail slime-turned status symbol managed to elevate entire economies. Imagine a bustling network of empires and cities, each vying for a slice of the Phoenician pie, or in this case, a jar of that luscious Tyrian purple. In the ancient world, the Mediterranean wasn't just a body of water, it was a superhighway of commerce, connecting the likes of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond. And smack dab in the middle of it all, like a savvy merchant at a marketplace bazaar, stood the Phoenicians, peddling their purples with the kind of enthusiasm that would make modern influencers green with envy. The economic impact of Phoenician purple was as expansive as the sea itself, reshaping trade networks and setting the stage for centuries of cross-cultural exchange. We're talking about a dye so coveted that it became a kind of ancient Bitcoin, a currency of prestige that everyone wanted to invest in. The elites of the time, from Roman senators to Egyptian pharaohs, were willing to shell out big time for a piece of this purple pie. It was a high-stakes game of supply and demand, with the Phoenicians holding all the cards, or in this case, the snails. The way the Phoenicians managed this operation was nothing short of an ancient MBA case study. They were shrewd negotiators and strategic thinkers, establishing trade routes that crisscrossed the Mediterranean like a spider's web. Tyre and Sidon became the epicenters of this purple empire, their ports bustling with activity as ships loaded with the precious dye set sail for distant shores. The influence of Tyrian purple was so pervasive that it even seeped into the language of trade. The word Phoenicia itself is believed to be derived from the Greek word for purple, phoenix. Talk about branding. Now, here's the kicker. While the Phoenicians basked in their purple glory, other regions were left scrambling to replicate their success. The allure of Tyrian purple was such that it inspired a host of imitators, each trying to crack the code and produce their own version of this luxurious dye. Spoiler alert, most of them failed spectacularly. The Egyptians, the Romans, even the Greeks, all took a stab at it, and while they produced some interesting new shades, none could quite capture the depth and richness of the original. It was like trying to recreate the recipe for Coca-Cola with a list of ingredients but no measurements. Close, but no cigar. This, of course, only added to the mystique of Tyrian purple. The Phoenicians had a secret sauce that nobody else could replicate, and they guarded it with the kind of secrecy usually reserved for state secrets and grandma's apple pie recipe. The myth of the royal purple monopoly wasn't entirely accurate. Other regions did produce purple dyes, but none had the same cachet or quality. The Phoenicians had managed to create not just a product, but a legend, one that would endure long after their civilization faded into history. And let's not forget the social and political clout that came with wearing this illustrious hue. To don Tyrian purple was to make a statement, to declare oneself part of the elite club that had both the means and the connections to acquire such a rarity. It was the ancient equivalent of driving a Bentley or sporting a Rolex status symbols that spoke volumes without saying a word. Emperors, kings, and high priests all draped themselves in purple, their robes a visual testament to their power and prestige. In a world where image was everything, Tyrian purple was the ultimate accessory. But here's the thing. While the Phoenicians had the monopoly on purple, they didn't have a monopoly on ambition. The economic impact of their dye extended beyond the trade networks they controlled. It influenced the very structure of power in the ancient world, with rulers using it as a tool of diplomacy and domination. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, recognized this and capitalized on the dye's allure, using it to reinforce their own imperial authority. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar famously decreed that only he could wear the full toga of Tyrian purple, a move that not only underscored his supremacy, but also cemented the dye's association with imperial dominion. The story of Phoenician purple is one of innovation, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of prestige. It's a testament to the power of branding and the art of perception, a reflection of human nature's unyielding desire to stand out and above. The Phoenicians turned a simple sea snail into a cornerstone of ancient commerce and, in doing so, left a legacy that continues to colour our understanding of history. As we sail further into the depths of this vibrant tale, remember, the true power of Tyrian purple lay not just in its hue, but in the hands of those who wielded it. The true power of Tyrian purple lay not just in its hue, but in the hands of those who wielded it. So, how did this smelly snail byproduct manage to weave itself into the very fabric of ancient society, shaping the elite classes across civilizations? Let's dive into the social and political ripple effects of this vivid dye, an ancient status symbol that made today's luxury brands seem like mere trinkets. First, let's talk about the socio-economic impact. Tyrian purple was the ancient world's equivalent of a black card, accessible only to the upper crust. We're talking about a colour so exclusive that even the wealthiest merchants had to wait in line, figuratively of course. The dye's labour-intensive production process meant it was priced astronomically high. A pound of this purple gold could cost a small fortune, sometimes equivalent to a year's salary for a common labourer. It's no wonder that only the elite could afford to drape themselves in such opulence. The dye became a glaring badge of privilege, an explicit marker of social stratification that screamed, "Look at me, I'm important!" This wasn't just about flaunting wealth, though. In the political arena, Tyrian purple became a tool of diplomacy and domination, a sartorial weapon wielded by the powerful. The Roman Empire, never one to miss an opportunity to establish dominance, embraced the dye as a symbol of imperial authority. Emperors and senators alike swathed themselves in purple robes, the fabric whispering a silent manifesto of supremacy and control. It was a visual assertion of their right to rule, an ancient version of a power suit. And let's not underestimate the Phoenicians' role in this colour-coded Game of Thrones. They weren't just purveyors of pretty fabric, they were the architects of an entire geopolitical strategy. By controlling the supply of Tyrian purple, the Phoenicians wielded significant influence over the social and political landscapes of their trade partners. Need a favour from a neighbouring king? The gift of Tyrian purple, wrapped in a bow of Phoenician charm, could seal the deal. It was diplomacy draped in violet, a strategic play that kept the Phoenicians in the good books of powerful allies. Trade records from the era reveal the extent of this purple diplomacy. Phoenician merchants were adept at navigating the complex web of Mediterranean politics, forming alliances that were as vibrant as the dye they peddled. They traded with the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and even the distant Spanish, establishing a network of political connections that would make a modern-day diplomat green with envy. It's no accident that the Phoenicians are often credited with spreading not just goods, but ideas and culture across the ancient world. They were the original influencers, using their dye as a ticket to the inner circles of power. But were the Phoenicians really the savvy marketers history paints them as? Or is this just another myth wrapped in purple silk? While they certainly had a knack for branding, Hello Phoenicia, named after the very colour they popularized, it's worth noting that they didn't exactly have a monopoly on marketing genius. Other civilizations, like the Greeks and Romans, were no slouches in the branding department. What set the Phoenicians apart was their ability to leverage their product into a political tool, a feat that required more than just marketing savvy. It required an understanding of human nature, of our innate desire for exclusivity and prestige. So, what's the takeaway from this tale of purple ambition? In a world where the right shade of fabric could elevate you to the ranks of the elite, the Phoenician dye industry offers a vivid lesson in the power of perception. It's a reminder that sometimes the most potent weapons are not swords or spears, but the subtle influence of colour and status. The Phoenicians understood this, and they used it to their advantage, weaving a legacy that continues to colour our understanding of history. As we continue to unravel the threads of this tale, remember that the story of Tyrian purple is far from over. We've seen how it shaped the elite classes and influenced political alliances, but there's more to this vibrant saga. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the economic underpinnings of the dye industry, exploring how it fueled the rise of the Phoenician cities and set the stage for their eventual decline. The journey is just beginning, and I promise it's going to be one colourful ride. As we dive back into this saga of purple ambition, let's cast our gaze on the less glamorous side of the Tyrian purple industry. Because, surprise, even ancient luxury had its dirty secrets. As much as the Phoenicians loved to bask in the glory of their purple empire, there were some serious trade-offs hiding in the shadows of those vibrant togas. First, let's talk tech, or rather, the lack thereof. The production of Tyrian purple wasn't exactly a high-tech affair. It was labour-intensive to the point of absurdity. Imagine this. It took about 250,000 murex snails just to produce 1 ounce of dye. Yep, you heard that right. 250,000 snails for a mere ounce. And if you think that sounds like a logistical nightmare, you're right. This wasn't just a case of a few people poking around the shoreline. We're talking about entire fleets of workers scouring the Mediterranean coastlines, gathering these little critters like they were going out of style. Once the snails were collected, it was time for the real fun to begin. The snails were cracked open to extract a tiny gland, which was then painstakingly processed to create the dye. The workers might as well have had patience tattooed on their foreheads. And while the end product was stunning, the process was anything but. It was a stinking, back-breaking endeavour that likely left the workers wondering if the colour purple was even worth it. Imagine the whiff of a rotten fish market mixed with the aroma of old gym socks. That's what Phoenician dye factories must have smelled like. But hold your nose, because we're just getting started. The environmental impact of this operation was nothing short of catastrophic. By today's standards, the Phoenician dye industry would be a poster child for unsustainability. All those snails didn't just grow on trees or, rocks. Overharvesting led to significant declines in murex snail populations, so much so that some areas experienced local extinctions. It's the kind of ecological footprint that would make modern environmentalists break out in a stress rash. And it wasn't just the snails. The coastal regions where these operations took place were left scarred and depleted. The stench of decomposing snail remains wasn't just unpleasant, it was a sign of environmental degradation. The Phoenicians, in their quest for purple supremacy, left behind a trail of ecological destruction that mirrored the environmental quandaries we face today. It's like the original tale of industrial pollution, long before smokestacks ever belched their first cloud of toxic smoke. So, what drove the Phoenicians to such lengths? The answer lies in the economics of supply and demand. With Tyrian purple being the ultimate luxury item, the price tag was astronomical. A pound of the dye could cost as much as a year's salary for a labourer. This created a gold rush mentality that pushed the Phoenicians to exploit their resources with little regard for sustainability. They were caught in a cycle of overproduction, all in the name of maintaining their monopoly on this coveted colour. This brings us to a critical question. Were the Phoenicians aware of the environmental havoc they were wreaking? There's no doubt that they had to notice the dwindling snail populations and the fouling of their coastal waters. But in a world where short-term gain often trumped long-term sustainability, the Phoenicians chose profit over preservation. It's a tale as old as time. One that echoes eerily with our modern struggles between economic growth and environmental stewardship. And yet, despite the devastation, the dye industry persisted. Why? Because the demand for Tyrian purple never waned. Kings, emperors, and elite citizens across the Mediterranean continued to clamour for this symbol of status and power. The Phoenicians, with their eyes firmly on the prize, turned a blind eye to the consequences. It's a stark reminder that the allure of luxury often blinds us to the cost at which it comes. But let's not just wag our fingers at the Phoenicians. They were, after all, products of their time, just as we are of ours. Their story is a cautionary tale of ambition run amok, a reflection of human nature's relentless pursuit of prestige, often at the expense of the environment. And while it's easy to judge from our modern vantage point, we must remember that history has a knack for repeating itself. So, as we continue to unravel the threads of this vibrant saga, Let's keep in mind the dual nature of Tyrian purple, a symbol of luxury and a harbinger of environmental woe. It's a tale of innovation and exploitation, of beauty and destruction, of human triumph and folly. And while the Phoenicians faded into history, their legacy and the lessons it holds continue to resonate. As we delve deeper into the economic and environmental underpinnings of their dye empire, we'll see how history's colourful threads are woven into the fabric of our modern world. Stay tuned as we explore the rise and fall of the Phoenician cities and the enduring impact of their purple ambition. It's a story that's far from over, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. And so, as the vibrant tapestry of Phoenician purple unfurls one last time, let's talk about its legacy. This little sea snail's dye didn't just colour fabric, it stained the annals of history. From the hem of a Roman senator's toga to the elaborate vestments of a Byzantine emperor, Tyrian purple was the original must-have item long before the term limited edition became a marketing cliché. Let's first tackle its influence on art and culture. You see, Tyrian purple wasn't just a colour, it was a statement, a visual crescendo in the symphony of ancient aesthetics. Artisans across empires incorporated this opulent hue into mosaics, frescoes, and tapestries, turning mundane objects into masterpieces. It's like the ancient world's version of adding a designer label to your everyday wardrobe. In this way, Tyrian purple was less about the colour itself and more about what it represented, the power to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. But what about today, you ask? Well, the legacy of Phoenician purple still lingers in our modern perceptions of luxury. Think of the purple carpet events or the phrase "born to the purple," used historically to describe someone of royal birth. Both are linguistic nods to the prestige once reserved for those who could afford to drape themselves in this illustrious dye. And let's not forget the luxury brands that draw on the mystique of exclusivity pioneered by our Phoenician friends. The allure of limited access, the tantalizing promise of rarity. It's a playbook as old as civilization itself. Speaking of exclusivity, let's address the modern parallels in branding. The Phoenicians were the original masters of scarcity marketing, a tactic that Apple and luxury fashion houses might tip their hats to today. By controlling the supply and cultivating the aura of Tyrian purple, they created a demand that defied the ages. In a way, every limited edition sneaker drop or haute couture release owes a debt to those ancient marketers who knew that the less you can have something, the more you want it. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What does this all tell us about human nature and economic evolution? Well, for starters, it reveals a timeless truth. We humans have an insatiable appetite for status. Whether it's a toga or a Tesla, we crave symbols that set us apart, that whisper or sometimes shout our place in the social hierarchy. This desire is a thread that runs through history, from the opulent courts of antiquity to the gleaming skyscrapers of today. And economically, the story of Phoenician purple is a textbook example of supply and demand. The scarcity of the dye drove its value through the roof, while the Phoenicians' strategic control of its production and distribution ensured that they remained at the top of the ancient economic food chain. It's a lesson in monopoly dynamics that still resonates in today's market-driven world, where controlling a resource, be it oil or intellectual property, can make or break empires. Now, let's not leave without a nod to the myth-busting, the romantic image of Phoenicians as romantic seafaring merchants peddling their wares across the Mediterranean is charming but incomplete. Behind the scenes, it was a gritty grind of labour and logistics, of environmental degradation and social stratification. Yet, it's these very contradictions that make history so compelling. The legend of Tyrian purple is a tale of aspiration and avarice, of beauty and brutality, woven into the fabric of our collective past. In the end, the Phoenicians left us more than just a colour. They left a legacy that continues to colour our world in ways both literal and metaphorical. Their story is a vivid reminder of the power of perception, the allure of exclusivity, and the relentless pursuit of prestige that drives human societies. And perhaps, most poignantly, it's a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition overshadows sustainability, a narrative that echoes all too clearly in our present day. So, the next time you see a flash of purple, think of the Phoenicians, those ancient architects of luxury, and remember the little snails that changed the world. Your eyes flutter open in the dim barracks. A cocoon of snoring, grumbling Hittite soldiers sprawled around you. The smell of barley bread, a staple here in 13th century BC Anatolia, mingles with the earthy scent of damp hay. Ah, the quintessential breakfast of champions, barley bread and a mug of frothy beer. Yes, you heard right, beer for breakfast. Not exactly the breakfast of modern Olympic athletes, but hey, it's got grains and hydration. Who needs a balanced meal when you've got liquid courage to start your day? As you munch on that dry, slightly stale bread, you can't help but reflect on the Hittite military machine that you're now a part of. The Hittite kingdom wasn't just some backwater speck on the map. It was a full-on ancient superpower. But unlike the glitzy Egyptians or the scholarly Babylonians, the Hittites were a bit more practical. Less pyramids, more iron-tipped spears. Speaking of which, the famous Hittite use of iron wasn't about making fancy jewelry, it was about making weapons that could skewer a foe with ruthless efficiency. But let's not kid ourselves, it wasn't iron that made you invincible. It was your wits, a bit of luck, and a sturdy pair of sandals. Conscription into the Hittite army wasn't exactly a career choice, it was more like a mandatory camping trip with weapons. If you were a Hittite dude, chances are you'd find yourself in the army at some point. And while the romantic notion of noble warriors riding into battle might tickle your fancy, the reality was less glamorous. Equipping a soldier wasn't cheap. We're talking about a cost that could easily rival your uncle's prized oxen. Between the leather armor, a trusty spear, and if you were really lucky, a spot in a chariot crew, outfitting a soldier was a serious investment for the kingdom. Ah, the chariots. The Hittites were the Formula One racers of the ancient world, with their chariots zipping across battlefields. They were like the ancient version of a sports car, sleek, fast, and utterly terrifying to the foot soldiers. But let's not get carried away. The myth of the invincible Hittite charioteers was just that, a myth. Sure, they were effective, but they weren't magic. They required well-maintained roads, flat terrain, and a steady supply of resources. Without these, even the most formidable chariot was just a wooden box on wheels. And about that famous invincibility, it's not like the Hittites were stomping around Anatolia, invulnerable to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. They were innovative, yes, but they had their fair share of logistical nightmares. Keeping an army fed, clothed, and equipped in the rugged terrain of Anatolia was akin to herding cats through a thunderstorm. Supply lines could stretch for miles, and if you were unlucky enough to lose them, well, you'd better hope you liked the taste of shoe leather. So as you finish that last crumb of barley bread, wash it down with a swig of beer, and prepare for another day of soldiering, remember, the Hittite army wasn't built on myths or magic. It was built on hard work, iron, and a bit of luck. The gods might be watching over you, but they're not going to do the heavy lifting. That's all on you, my friend. Now that you're fueled up with that breakfast of barley bread and beer, it's time to stumble out into the crisp Anatolian morning for the daily grind military drills. As you and your fellow soldiers assemble, the political landscape of Anatolia looms over you like an invisible general, shaping your every move. Welcome to the Hittite Empire, circa 13th century BC, where the stakes were as high as the granite peaks surrounding you. You see, the Hittites weren't just sitting around playing board games in the heartland of Anatolia. They were busy expanding their territory like a group of ancient real estate moguls. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill land grab. It was a calculated expansion driven by political savvy, economic necessity, and yes, the occasional bout of good old-fashioned warfare. But unlike some other ancient empires, the Hittites preferred alliances over outright conquest when they could get away with it. Why waste resources when a strategic handshake could do the trick? Take, for instance, the relationship with Egypt. Ah, Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, pyramids, and enough gold to make Midas look like a penny pincher. You've probably heard about the epic rivalry between the Hittites and the Egyptians, right? The stuff of legends, where two mighty powers clashed like titans on the battlefield. But let's pump the brakes on that narrative. The truth is a bit more nuanced. Sure, they were rivals, but it was more like a game of chess than a bar brawl. Each side maneuvered for power, using diplomacy, espionage, and yes, the occasional skirmish to tip the scales in their favor. One of the most famous skirmishes, or rather, the mother of all ancient battles, was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. You've got Ramses II on one side, strutting around with an ego as big as a pyramid, and Muwatalli II on the other, with his Hittite troops ready to rumble. The Battle of Kadesh was like the Super Bowl of ancient conflicts, except instead of touchdowns, you had chariots and spears. But here's the kicker. Both sides claimed victory. That's right, you could call it the first instance of spin doctoring in recorded history. The Egyptians, in particular, were masters of propaganda. Ramses II had temples decorated with grandiose reliefs depicting his supposed triumph at Kadesh. To hear him tell it, he single-handedly turned the tide of battle with a chariot charge that made the gods themselves take notice. But the reality? A stalemate. Both sides took a beating and then went back to their respective corners to lick their wounds. Yet, Ramses's version of events was plastered everywhere from temple walls to obelisks. It was the ancient equivalent of a viral social media campaign. On the Hittite side, Muwatalli II was less concerned with telling tall tales and more focused on consolidating power in the region. While the Egyptians were busy crafting their narrative, the Hittites were shoring up alliances with neighbouring states and extending their influence. They weren't just about flexing military muscle, they were creating a network of vassal states and trade partners. The Hittites knew that power wasn't just about who had the biggest army, but who had the most friends. It was like a very high-stakes game of diplomacy, where the loser could end up with their country carved up like a turkey at a feast. And speaking of feasts, let's talk about the economic underpinnings of all this military and political manoeuvring. The Hittite economy was a complex beast, driven by agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade. Anatolia wasn't exactly the Fertile Crescent, but it had its share of resources. Grain, livestock, and minerals were the lifeblood of the empire, feeding not just the population but the ever-hungry war machine. To keep things running smoothly, the Hittites relied on a combination of centralized control and local autonomy. Think of it as a franchise model, where regional governors had some freedom to manage their affairs, but always answered to the great king. Back on the training ground, the drills continue, and as you practice your spear thrusts and shield maneuvers, remember that you're part of a grand strategy that's both gritty and grandiose. The myths of the Hittite-Egyptian rivalry make for a great story, but the truth is far more intricate. It's about power plays, resource management, and a healthy dose of ancient politics. The Hittites weren't just warriors, they were diplomats, economists, and, yes, sometimes storytellers, crafting a narrative that would endure through the ages. So keep that spear steady, because the history you're living is as much about the ink as it is about the iron. And just when you think you've got the spear thrusts and shield maneuvers down, midday arrives with the subtlety of a Hittite chariot charge. Time to shift gears from training to the real deal, or hypothetical real deal, since today's all about preparing for a skirmish. Welcome to the life of a Hittite soldier, where battle tactics are as much about survival as they are about strategy. First things first, let's talk formations. The Hittites didn't just throw soldiers into the fray like a bunch of toddlers at a daycare. Nope, they were organized with a capital O. Picture this, a tight-knit phalanx, shields up, spears angled like the world's spikiest porcupine. This wasn't just for show, mind you. It was a calculated move to keep you alive, and maybe even win the day. The formation was all about maximizing your strengths and minimizing those pesky weaknesses, like, say, the very real possibility of getting skewered by enemy spears. Now, don't let the sight of all those shields and spears fool you into thinking this was a foolproof plan. The phalanx had its Achilles heel. Literally, mobility was an issue. Maneuvering this walking fortress required coordination that could make a Broadway dancer sweat. And if you lost cohesion, say, because the guy in front of you decided today was a good day to trip over his own sandals, it was every Hittite for himself. Speaking of sandals, let's not forget the terrain. Anatolia's landscape was as varied as the plot twists in a soap opera. You could be marching through lush valleys one minute and scrambling over rocky hills the next. The Hittites knew that terrain was more than just a backdrop. It was a silent player in every battle. Flat terrain was a charioteer's dream. But try taking those chariots up a hill and you've got yourself an ancient version of a traffic jam. Weather, too, was a fickle friend. A sudden rain could turn a battlefield into a mud pit, with soldiers slipping and sliding like they were in some bizarre ancient ice skating rink. And heat? Oh boy. Anatolian summers could roast you alive under that leather armor, turning your hypothetical skirmish into a very real sweat fest. The Hittites didn't have the luxury of checking the weather app, so they had to be ready for anything. come rain, shine, or the occasional dust storm. Now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty, the human and economic costs of warfare. Equipping a soldier wasn't just about handing him a spear and patting him on the back. No, sir. Each soldier was an investment, a walking, breathing collection of valuable resources. Leather armor, iron-tipped spears, and those fancy chariots didn't grow on trees. The kingdom's coffers took a hit every time a new recruit stepped onto the field. And let's not even start on casualties. Every fallen soldier meant a loss, not just of life, but of economic value, a blow to both family and state. The ripple effects of these battles didn't stop at the battlefield. They reached deep into the everyday life of the Hittite people. With so many men off fighting, agricultural production could take a nosedive. It's hard to plough a field when you're busy holding off an enemy assault. And what about the families left behind? Women and children had to pick up the slack, managing farms and households while their men were off playing soldier. It was a tough gig, and one that didn't always come with a happy ending. And here's where we bust a few myths. The romantic notion of the noble warrior fighting for glory and honor is all well and good, but the reality was a tad less glamorous. Sure, there were moments of heroism, plenty of them, but there was also fear, exhaustion, and the very real possibility of not making it home. The Hittites, like any other ancient people, had to balance the stories they told with the harsh truths they lived. So as you prepare for that hypothetical skirmish, remember that the Hittite way of war was as much about brains as it was about brawn. It was a complex dance of strategy, economics, and sheer human will. And while the myths paint a picture of invincible warriors and grand victories, the reality was a bit more down to earth, much like the barley bread you had for breakfast. But hey, let's not get too bogged down in the gritty details. There's still a lot more to explore in the life of a Hittite soldier. The day's not over yet, and neither is our story. Keep that shield steady, and your wits sharper than your spear. You're part of a grand narrative that's still unfolding, with plenty of battles to fight and tales to tell. The day drags on, and you find yourself in the aftermath of a skirmish that was more about strategic posturing than an all-out brawl. As you and your comrades retreat to camp, it's time to shift from warrior to repairman. Your shield's got more dents than a used chariot, and your spearhead is dangerously close to losing its edge. Welcome to the not-so-glamorous side of ancient warfare, where the battle doesn't end when the spears stop flying. The Hittite army wasn't just a bunch of guys with weapons, it was a mobile economy, a walking marketplace of iron and leather. Each soldier represented a significant investment, not just in terms of equipment, but in terms of the logistical ballet that kept you fed, clothed, and armed. In a world without Amazon Prime, this was no small feat. The Hittites had to manage supply chains that stretched across rugged Anatolian terrain, relying on a network of trade routes and local resources. Think of it as the ancient version of just-in-time delivery, minus the GPS. Let's talk numbers. Outfitting a Hittite warrior was no small expense. A decent spear might cost you around 15 shekels, while the leather armor could set the state back another 30. That's a lot of barley bread, folks. And don't even get started on those chariots. Each one was like a luxury car, requiring skilled craftsmen to keep the wheels rolling. The wood, the metal fittings, the leather harnesses, all of it had to be sourced, crafted, and maintained. It was a logistical headache that would make a modern supply chain manager break into a cold sweat. Now, before you start picturing the Hittite kingdom as some sort of ancient economic utopia, let's bust a few bubbles. The economy wasn't just humming along smoothly because everyone was sipping on barley beer and singing Kumbaya. It was under constant strain, with resources flowing towards the war machine like water down a hill. The burden on the state was immense, with military campaigns draining the treasury faster than a hole in a wine flask. And who footed the bill for all this? Well, ultimately, it was the local populations. Taxes, tributes, and tithes. Call them what you will, they all meant the same thing. The common folk were the ones keeping the empire's wheels turning. Villagers were expected to provide grain, livestock, and manpower. If you were a farmer, your fields might be stripped bare to feed the troops. If you were a craftsman, your skills would be commandeered for the war effort. It was a system that kept the empire afloat, but left little room for personal prosperity. But let's not forget the flip side of this coin. The Hittites weren't just extracting resources, they were also integrating their territories into a broader economic network. This wasn't just some top-down exploitation. Regional governors had some autonomy, and local economies could thrive under the right conditions. Trade routes expanded, connecting distant lands and bringing exotic goods to the heart of Anatolia. It was a web of commerce that added a layer of complexity to the empire's power dynamics. So how did the Hittites manage to keep this elaborate machine running without modern technology? It wasn't magic, though it might have seemed that way to an outsider. The key was organization and a hefty dose of good old-fashioned manpower. Think scribes with clay tablets, notepads of the ancient world, meticulously tracking supplies and troop movements. Messengers on horseback, the ancient equivalent of email, carried orders across the empire. It was a system that relied on human ingenuity and the sheer will to make it work. And here's where things get really interesting. The Hittites weren't content to just rely on brute force and economic might. They also understood the power of narrative. Myths and stories weren't just bedtime tales, they were tools of political control and social cohesion. By creating a shared identity, the Hittite rulers could foster loyalty and unity among their diverse subjects. It was a strategy that turned myth into a kind of social glue, binding the empire together even as it expanded. So as you sit by the campfire, working the kinks out of your armor and sharpening your spear, remember that you're part of something much bigger than yourself. It's not just about the battles you fight or the lands you conquer. It's about the intricate web of relationships, resources, and narratives that make up the Hittite world. The myths might tell of invincible warriors and glorious victories, but the reality is a complex dance of diplomacy, economics, and human ambition. And while the campfire crackles and the stars begin to peek through the Anatolian sky, you can't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer audacity of it all. The Hittites weren't just building an empire, they were creating a legacy, a story that would echo through history, blending romance and reality into a tapestry as intricate as the one you're living now. So keep those eyes sharp and that spear sharper, because the tale of the Hittite soldier is far from over. There's still much more to uncover, and the next chapter, that's another day in the life of a Hittite soldier, awaits. As the campfire flickers and the Anatolian night wraps around you like a well-worn cloak, the day's adrenaline begins to ebb. It's a peculiar time of reflection, this winding down with the rest of the soldiers. You're surrounded by the sounds of men talking, the occasional bark of laughter, and the ever-present rustle of leather armor being loosened. It's a moment to breathe, to let the day's dirt settle, and to ponder not just your place in the Hittite war machine, but in the grand tapestry of history itself. Now, let's talk about the elephant, or rather, the chariot in the room, the decline of the Hittite Empire. Around 1200 BC, just as you're getting the hang of being a soldier, things start to unravel faster than a poorly woven tunic. It's a tale as old as time, internal strife, external pressures, and a series of unfortunate events conspiring to bring down what was once a formidable force. The Hittite Empire's downfall wasn't due to one single cataclysmic event, but a slow, grinding decay that gnawed away at the edges until there was nothing left to hold it together. Internally, the Hittite Empire was like a family holiday, gathering gone wrong, sibling rivalries, power struggles, and grudges simmering beneath the surface. The central government, once a well-oiled machine, was starting to sputter. The decentralized nature of the empire, which had been its strength, became its Achilles heel. Regional governors, those once loyal vassals, began to see themselves more as independent rulers than subordinates to the great king. It was like trying to herd cats, only these cats had armies. Externally, the pressure was mounting like a storm on the horizon. The infamous sea peoples, whose identities remain as murky as a poorly brewed beer, began marauding across the eastern Mediterranean. These were not your run-of-the-mill raiders. They were a whirlwind of destruction that swept through established powers faster than you could say invasion. The Hittites, already stretched thin, found themselves unable to repel these relentless incursions, and their once mighty defences crumbled under the weight of constant attack. Economically, the empire was treading water. The cost of maintaining a sprawling military and managing far-flung territories was bleeding the treasury dry. When the resources ran low, so did morale. The empire's intricate trade networks, so vital to its prosperity, began to fray. Local economies, once bustling under the watchful eye of regional governors, faced disruptions that rippled through the entire system. Grain shortages led to famines, which in turn fueled unrest among the population. It was a vicious cycle that left the Hittites gasping for air. And then there was the climate. Yes, even in ancient times, Mother Nature had a way of throwing a wrench into the works. Severe droughts hit Anatolia, turning fertile lands into barren stretches. As crops failed and food became scarce, the people looked to their leaders for answers that were in short supply. The earth itself seemed to conspire against the Hittites, adding another layer of complexity to their woes. So as you sit there, perhaps contemplating the irony of fighting to preserve an empire that's already teetering on the brink, it's worth pondering what we can learn from this grand collapse. The Hittite Empire's fall serves as a stark reminder of the delicate balance between power and stability. It's a cautionary tale about the perils of overextension, the importance of strong centralized control, and the need for adaptability in the face of change. Yet, amidst the decline, there's a certain romantic allure to the Hittite story. This was an empire that rose from the rugged terrain of Anatolia to become a power that challenged the likes of Egypt. Its legacy isn't just in the ruins it left behind, but in the myths it inspired and the lessons it imparts. The Hittites were not just warriors, they were diplomats, traders, and storytellers. Their narrative is woven into the larger fabric of history, a thread that continues to intrigue and inspire. As the embers of a campfire glow softly, casting shadows that flicker like ghostly echoes of a bygone era, you're left with a sense of both closure and curiosity. The day's lessons of strategy, economics, and the human cost of empire linger in the air, a testament to the complexity of history. It's a reminder that behind every legend lies a reality that's gritty, nuanced, and profoundly human. So, as you lay back and gaze at the stars, twinkling reminders of the vastness of time and space, take a moment to appreciate the story you're part of. The Hittite Empire may have fallen, but its tale endures, a tapestry of ambition and adversity that continues to captivate. Tomorrow you'll rise with the dawn, ready to face whatever challenges come your way. But for now, let the night cradle you in its embrace, a soldier of a forgotten empire, dreaming of the stories yet to be told. Nelson Mandela's story begins in a small village in the Eastern Cape of South Africa called Mvezo. But don't let its size fool you. This place was a breeding ground for future greatness. Born on July 18, 1918, Mandela was given the name Roli Halala, a Xhosa term meaning pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, troublemaker. It's almost like his parents knew he'd spend his life shaking things up. Mvezo was a place where the only skyscrapers were the mountains, and the closest thing to a rush hour was the occasional cattle crossing. It was here that Mandela's spirit began to take shape, nurtured by tales of African history and culture shared by his family. Life in Mvezo wasn't exactly a luxury getaway. In the early 20th century, South Africa was wrapped in the chains of colonial rule, and Mvezo was no exception. It was a time when oxen were more common than automobiles, and literacy rates were lower than the current average temperature on Mars. But for young Mandela, the lessons he learned at home were just the beginning. His father, Gardler Henry Mfakanyiswa, was a local chief and councillor to the Thembu royal family, which gave Mandela a front-row seat to the tribal politics that would later shape his understanding of leadership and justice. After his father's death, Mandela was sent to live with the Thembu regent, Jongintaba Dalindyebo, in the village of Kunu. This was a significant upgrade from Mvezo, but Kunu was still more haylofts than high-rises. Nevertheless, it was here that Mandela attended his first school, where his teacher, Miss Medingane, decided to give him the name Nelson on his first day. Why Nelson? Well, because back then, British names were all the rage in South African schools. Who wouldn't want to be named after a famous British admiral when you could have something like Hercules or Maximus? Fast forward a few years, and Mandela found himself at the University of Fort Hare, the only Western-style institution of higher learning for black Africans in Southern Africa at the time. Fort Hare was like the Harvard of its day, minus the ivy-covered walls, and with a bit more focus on surviving the political climate than just surviving finals week. It was a melting pot of ideas and a hub for future African leaders. Yet, it was also a place where the spirit of rebellion was never far from the surface. Mandela quickly became involved in student politics, because what else do you do at university besides question authority and occasionally attend lectures? He was elected to the Student Representative Council, but the administration's autocratic rule did not sit well with him. The university administration, acting like the overzealous hall monitors they were, expected students to follow rules without question. Naturally, Mandela and his peers decided to protest against the quality of food and the lack of power they had in decision-making. The administration's response was as swift as it was predictable. They expelled him. This little episode was a foreshadowing of the rebellious nature that would define Mandela's life. He was just 21 years old at the time, and already he was standing up to authority figures. His expulsion was a clear sign. Mandela wasn't going to let a little thing like institutional oppression get in the way of his education or his future. The socio-economic landscape of South Africa during Mandela's formative years was a patchwork of inequality. The country was rich in resources. Gold and diamonds were more common than Wi-Fi in a modern coffee shop, but the wealth was as unevenly distributed as the rain in the Sahara. While the white minority enjoyed a lifestyle that could rival European standards, the black majority was stuck in a cycle of poverty with limited access to education and employment. The system of apartheid, which would later become official government policy, was already being woven into the fabric of society through laws and practices that segregated and oppressed the non-white population. Mandela's expulsion from Fort Hare didn't deter him for long. He moved to Johannesburg, the city of gold, seeking work and further education. This bustling metropolis was a far cry from the rural simplicity of Mvezo or even Fort Hare. Here, Mandela would witness firsthand the stark realities of apartheid as he worked in a gold mine and later as a clerk in a law firm. Johannesburg was a city of contrasts, where the mansions of the affluent were a stone's throw from the overcrowded townships of the poor. It was a place where the rules of segregation were enforced with brutal efficiency, yet it was also a place of opportunity and resistance. In Johannesburg, Mandela met people who would become lifelong comrades in the fight against apartheid, including Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. These relationships were pivotal, as they would form the backbone of the African National Congress, ANC, leadership. It was here that Mandela's political consciousness truly began to take shape, as he witnessed the everyday injustices faced by black South Africans. He saw the laws that kept people from moving freely, the passbooks that controlled their lives, and the relentless police brutality that kept the system in place. Mandela's early life was a tapestry of experiences that prepared him for the monumental task of dismantling apartheid. His upbringing in Mvezo and Tunu taught him the importance of community and resilience. His time at Fort Hare and in Johannesburg exposed him to the harsh realities of racial inequality and the power of education and organization. These elements combined to form a foundation that would support his lifelong struggle for justice and equality. So, there you have it, Nelson Mandela, the young troublemaker from Mvezo, expelled from university for standing up to authority and thrust into the heart of South Africa's socio-political turmoil. His journey from a small village to becoming a global icon is one of grit, determination, and an unyielding spirit. But don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning of the story. Mandela's life was about to take on challenges that would test even the most steadfast of spirits. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. From the dusty, bustling streets of Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela took his first steps into the legal world, a move that would lay the groundwork for his future as a revolutionary leader. Now, let's not get too misty-eyed about the glamour of law offices. Mandela's legal career was less suits and more gritty reality. He started as a clerk at the law firm Witkin, Sadelsky and Eidelman, where he had to deal with more paperwork than Perry Mason ever dreamed of. Here, he learned the law's power and limitations, a crucial education for someone who'd later challenged the oppressive system that used it as a weapon. In 1952, Mandela co-founded South Africa's first black law firm with his friend Oliver Tambo. Mandela and Tambo Attorneys was born out of necessity. It was a legal lifeline for black South Africans who had about as much access to justice as a snowball has to survival in the Kalahari Desert. The firm operated out of a small office in Chancellor House, Johannesburg, a building that became a beacon of hope and resistance. Imagine trying to run a legal practice with the government breathing down your neck and the odds stacked higher than a Jenga tower at a caffeine-fueled game night. Yet, they persisted, defending clients who faced the brutally discriminatory laws of apartheid. Meanwhile, Mandela's involvement with the African National Congress ANC was deepening. The ANC, which was about as popular with the apartheid government as a rainstorm at a BBQ, was committed to fighting racial discrimination. Mandela joined the ranks of the Defiance Campaign in 1952, which was essentially civil disobedience with a side of courage. It was a coordinated effort to break apartheid laws by flooding prisons with so many protesters that the system couldn't cope. It was a peaceful revolution, and Mandela was at its heart, organising and strategizing like a maestro conducting a symphony of resistance. Now, let's talk about the infamous Black Pimpernel saga of 1961. Picture this, Mandela on the run, evading authorities with the kind of agility that makes Jason Bourne look like he's in slow motion. But let's dial back the Hollywood glamour for a second. This wasn't about car chases and tuxedos, though Mandela did have a penchant for sharp suits. It was about survival and strategy. He travelled the country under various aliases, including David Motsamai, wearing disguises that were more about practicality than style. He was a master of blending in, a chameleon in a society painted in stark black and white. The myth of Mandela as a suave secret agent is tempting, but the reality was far grittier. His evasion of capture was no romantic escapade. It was a calculated necessity to continue organising against apartheid. He once said, "A good head and a good heart are always a formidable combination." This wasn't about being a hero in a spy thriller. It was about staying one step ahead in a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than freedom itself. As Mandela crisscrossed South Africa, he worked tirelessly to garner support for the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, meaning Spear of the Nation. Established in 1961, MK was a response to the increasing violence and oppression faced by black South Africans. Mandela understood the grim reality. Peaceful protest had its limits in the face of a regime that responded with brutality. It was time for a change in tactics. By day, Mandela was the Black Pimpernel, but by night he was a strategist, planning acts of sabotage designed to disrupt the apartheid regime without causing loss of life. These were not the acts of a reckless rebel, but of a man who realized that sometimes, when the law is unjust, justice requires a bold approach. "We of Umkhonto have always sought to achieve liberation without bloodshed and civil clash," Mandela declared. Yet he also knew that the path to freedom was fraught with peril. Economically, South Africa was a nation of contrasts. The country was sitting on a gold mine, literally. Gold and diamonds were abundant, yet the wealth was as unevenly distributed as sunscreen at a vampire convention. The economy thrived on the backs of cheap labour enforced by apartheid laws, making resistance not just a moral imperative, but an economic necessity for equality. In 1962, Mandela left South Africa for the first time, travelling across Africa and to England to gain support for the anti-apartheid movement. His passport was far from legitimate, more like a DIY travel document forged to keep him out of the clutches of South African authorities. During this trip he met with leaders and activists, soaking up ideas and strategies like a sponge, all while spreading the word about the struggle back home. Upon his return, Mandela was arrested in a police roadblock outside Howick, KwaZulu-Natal, thanks to a tip-off proving that even the Black Pimpernel couldn't outrun the long arm of apartheid for long. He was charged with leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. It was during this trial that Mandela delivered his first public political statement, where he famously declared, "I am prepared to die," highlighting his unwavering commitment to the cause. Mandela's arrest was a blow to the movement, but also a rallying cry. It exposed the lengths to which the apartheid government would go to crush dissent, galvanizing support both locally and internationally. The trial, however, was just the beginning of Mandela's long, arduous journey through the labyrinth of apartheid's legal system, a journey that would test the limits of his endurance and resolve. As we leave Mandela at this pivotal juncture, understand that his story is far from over. His strategic mind, forged in the fires of legal battles and political resistance, was about to face challenges that would make even the most stoic among us shudder. But we'll save that for the next chapter, where the fight intensifies and Mandela's legacy begins to take shape amidst the harsh realities of a divided nation. Stay tuned, because the saga of Nelson Mandela is like a gripping novel you can't put down, full of twists, turns, and the indomitable spirit of a man who refused to yield. As Nelson Mandela found himself ensnared in the clutches of apartheid's legal apparatus, The stage was set for a showdown that would capture the world's attention. Enter the Rivonia trial of 1963-64, a courtroom drama that was less about law and order and more about the raw, unvarnished struggle for justice. Mandela and his co-defendants, leaders of the African National Congress, ANC, were charged with sabotage, a word that sounds like it belongs in a spy novel, but in reality was a desperate tactic against an oppressive regime. The trial was named after the Rivonia suburb of Johannesburg, where police had raided the ANC's secret hideout, Lily's Leaf Farm, in 1963. Think of Lily's Leaf as the ANC's Batcave, minus the gadgets and with more revolutionary pamphlets. The authorities seized documents that laid bare the group's plans to overthrow the apartheid state, which was about as welcomed by the government as a skunk at a garden party. Mandela, already serving a 5-year sentence for leaving the country illegally and inciting a strike, faced the new charges alongside 9 other accused. The trial began on October 9, 1963, with the apartheid government pulling out all the stops, using every legal trick in the book, and some they likely scribbled in the margins. The charges carried a potential death sentence, adding a chilling undertone to the proceedings. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a life-or-death struggle, cloaked in courtroom formality. Now, let's talk about Mandela's courtroom presence. Forget the image of the downtrodden prisoner. Mandela entered the court with the calm dignity of a man who knew he was on the right side of history. His demeanour was a masterclass in defiance, a silent testament that screamed louder than any protest. You could say he was the courtroom equivalent of a mic drop, but with more gravitas and less showmanship. On April 20, 1964, Mandela took the stand to deliver what would become one of the most iconic speeches of the 20th century. His words were a seismic event, shaking the very foundations of the apartheid regime. "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination," he declared. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." This wasn't just a speech, it was a manifesto, a call to arms, and a declaration of unwavering commitment all rolled into one. Mandela wasn't pleading for his life, he was laying down a gauntlet, challenging the world to take notice. And notice they did. The global reaction was swift and emphatic. In a time when communication was more snail mail than Snapchat, Mandela's words travelled the globe, igniting protests and calls for his release from places as far-flung as Washington, D.C. and Moscow. But let's not romanticize this moment too much. Yes, it was powerful and moving, but it was also a strategic move. Mandela knew the eyes of the world were on him, and he used the trial as a platform to spotlight the injustices of apartheid. It was less about saving himself, and more about saving his country from the chains of oppression. Behind the scenes, the legal and political maneuverings were as complex as a Rubik's Cube wrapped in red tape. The defence team, comprised of some of South Africa's most skilled advocates, had to navigate a legal system stacked against them, where justice was as elusive as a mirage in the desert. Meanwhile, the apartheid government was determined to make an example of the accused, hoping to squash the growing tide of resistance. Economically, South Africa was a pressure cooker ready to blow. The trial highlighted the unsustainable nature of a system that relied on the exploitation of the black majority to maintain the wealth and privilege of the white minority. The world was waking up to this reality, and the economic sanctions that would later cripple the apartheid regime were starting to take shape. The trial dragged on for months, with the tension inside the courtroom mirrored by the unrest outside. Protests and demonstrations erupted worldwide, with people donning Free Mandela badges and chanting slogans that echoed Mandela's call for freedom. This international solidarity was a thorn in the side of the apartheid government, which found itself increasingly isolated on the global stage. Finally, on June 12, 1964, the verdict was handed down. Mandela and 7 of his co-defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment. The death penalty had been avoided, but the sentences were as harsh as they were predictable. The world reacted with a mix of outrage and resolve, turning Mandela's imprisonment into a potent symbol of resistance. Inside South Africa, Mandela's incarceration was intended to silence him, to erase him from the narrative of resistance. But instead, it had the opposite effect. Mandela became a legend, his name synonymous with the struggle for freedom and equality. The government had hoped to quash the rebellion by locking him away, but instead they had unwittingly made him a martyr, a rallying point for the oppressed and the righteous alike. Mandela's time in prison would test his spirit and resolve in ways unimaginable, but it would also fortify him, turning him into the leader who would eventually dismantle the very system that sought to break him. But that's a story for another day. For now, know that the Rivonia trial was a turning point, a line in the sand drawn with the blood and sweat of those who dared to dream of a better South Africa. The fight was far from over, but Mandela's spirit remained unyielded, a beacon of hope in a world desperately in need of light. So, there we are, Mandela sentenced to life, but instead of fading into obscurity, his legend only grows. Now, let's step into the paradox of Robben Island, where the prison gates closed behind him in 1964. Robben Island was less a vacation spot and more like a grim island fortress 7 kilometres off the coast of Cape Town. It had been the forgotten corner where they stashed everyone from lepers to political prisoners, and now it was Mandela's new home. Mandela's daily routine was as predictable as an old clock. Wake up at the crack of dawn, breakfast at 7:30 a.m, and then it was off to the limestone quarry, where he spent his days chipping away at the rocks under the blistering sun. The prison authorities thought hard labour and isolation would break him, but clearly they underestimated the power of sheer will and a good pair of sunglasses. The glare from the white rocks was so intense it permanently damaged Mandela's eyesight. Yet it also gave him time to think, plan and reflect on the bigger picture. Now, Mandela wasn't exactly swapping recipes with the guards, but he did form unlikely friendships. Take James Gregory, for instance. Gregory was a warden who learned Xhosa, Mandela's native language, to understand what the prisoners were saying. Over time, their relationship morphed from wary coexistence to a unique friendship. Gregory would later become one of Mandela's staunchest supporters, proving that even in the starkest environments, humanity can find common ground. Mandela's prison life wasn't all quarry work and quiet reflection, though. He and his fellow inmates turned Robben Island into what they called the university. They would hold secret discussions on politics, philosophy, and history, smuggling in books and news with the kind of stealth that would make a spy thriller look like a children's bedtime story. Mandela himself studied Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors, because he believed in knowing his adversary inside and out. It was a tactical mastery that would later serve him well in negotiations. But let's not kid ourselves, the conditions were brutal. Mandela's cell was a cramped 8 7 feet, with a floor mat and a bucket for a toilet. Calls it minimalist living, if you're feeling generous. Most would just call it inhumane. Yet, within those walls, Mandela's influence only grew. Letters smuggled out of the prison circulated his thoughts, and he remained a guiding force for the ANC even from behind bars. His name became a rallying cry, the symbol of resistance, whispered in hushed tones and chanted in protests. Outside the walls of Robben Island, the world was waking up to the atrocities of apartheid. The 1970s and 80s saw a burgeoning international movement to end the regime, fueled by protests, cultural boycotts, and economic sanctions. The numbers don't lie. By 1985, direct foreign investment in South Africa had plummeted by 60% compared to just a decade earlier. The sanctions were hitting where it hurt, right in the economic solar plexus. South Africa's economy was taking a nosedive, and the government's wallet was feeling the pinch. Mandela's imprisonment became a cause célèbre, a global symbol of injustice. Concerts, rallies, and campaigns were launched, with luminaries like Stevie Wonder and Bob Dylan lending their voices to the Free Mandela movement. The pressure was mounting on the South African government, and Mandela was the key piece in the geopolitical chess game. They tried to paint him as a terrorist, but the world saw through it, recognizing the inherent absurdity of labeling a man who fought for equality in the same breath as those who upheld a system of oppression. Despite the isolation, Mandela was far from an isolated figure. He was the conductor of an orchestra he couldn't see, directing the symphony of resistance from his cell. His leadership style was less about barking orders and more about inspiring those around him to rise to the occasion. It's like he had an invisible megaphone, amplifying his influence across continents. The myth of Mandela as a lone hero is appealing, but the reality was a tapestry of collective struggle. He was part of a broader movement, a network of individuals who shared his vision for a free and equal South Africa. His letters and messages, meticulously written and smuggled out, were threads keeping the fabric of the ANC strong and interconnected. Mandela was the face of the struggle, but it was the countless unnamed who were the backbone. By the late 1980s, the South African government was cornered, their economy hemorrhaging and their international standing in tatters. They began to reconsider their stance on Mandela like gamblers with a losing hand. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered Mandela conditional release if he renounced violence, but Mandela declined, stating, "What freedom am I being offered while the organisation of the people remains banned?" It was quintessential Mandela unwavering in his principles, refusing to compromise on the core of the struggle. Meanwhile, the world continued to rally. The Commonwealth heads of government were drafting plans for tougher sanctions, and the United Nations was passing resolutions condemning the apartheid regime. It was a multi-pronged assault, hitting political, economic and cultural fronts. Economic sanctions, in particular, were a game-changer. With international companies pulling out, the South African economy was floundering, like a ship caught in a storm without a compass. By 1988, Mandela was moved to Victor Verster prison, a step up from the confines of Robben Island. Here he lived in a cottage with a swimming pool and a cook. Think of it as the penthouse of prisons. The government was trying to soften his image, perhaps hoping to ease into negotiations. It was a calculated move, an attempt to reframe the narrative as the winds of political change started to gust. As Mandela's prison years dragged into decades, his resolve remained as unyielding as ever. He continued to push for dialogue, understanding that the path to peace often required sitting with your adversaries. In secret talks with government officials, he advocated for a peaceful transition to democracy. It was like negotiating with your hands tied, yet Mandela's strategic mind was as sharp as ever, navigating the complexities with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Outside, the world was changing rapidly. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, signalling the crumbling of old regimes and heralding new possibilities. The Cold War was thawing, and the apartheid government could feel the heat. Their time was running out, and Mandela was the linchpin in the transition to a new South Africa. As we leave this part of Mandela's story, remember that his journey was far from solitary. It was a collective struggle, a tapestry woven from the threads of courage, resilience, and an unyielding spirit. Mandela's imprisonment was meant to silence him, but instead it amplified his voice, echoing across the globe, reminding us all that sometimes the strongest chains are those we break within ourselves. Stay tuned, because the saga is far from over, and Mandela's most significant chapters are yet to unfold. As the world teetered on the edge of a new decade, Nelson Mandela's imprisonment was about to come to a dramatic end. It was February 11, 1990, and the stage was set for a moment that seemed more like a grand finale than a fresh start. South Africa was a nation in the throes of change, and Mandela's release was the catalyst that would ignite the dismantling of apartheid, a system so entrenched it was practically fossilized. Stepping out of Victor Verster prison, Mandela was more than just a free man, he was the embodiment of resilience. At 71, he walked with the grace of a man who had endured decades behind bars, but never let his spirit falter. The world watched as he took those historic steps, his fist raised in a silent salute to freedom, a gesture that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. It was a moment caught on film, destined to become as iconic as the moon landing or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But let's not sugarcoat it. Mandela's release wasn't the result of a sudden burst of goodwill from the apartheid regime. It was a calculated move, orchestrated by a government that had finally realized it was cornered by international sanctions, internal unrest, and economic decline. The South African economy was hemorrhaging faster than a sieve trying to hold water, with GDP growth stagnating and inflation spiraling out of control like a cat in a room full of laser pointers. The road ahead was anything but smooth. The next 4 years would test Mandela's negotiation skills to their limits as he navigated the treacherous waters of political transition. The stakes were higher than a kite in a hurricane, with South Africa's future hanging in the balance. It was a delicate dance between the old guard clinging to their power and the rising tide of change demanding justice and equality. Mandela's approach to negotiation was a masterclass in diplomacy. He understood that peacemaking wasn't about grand gestures or fiery speeches. It was about finding common ground, even if it meant swallowing a bitter pill or two. His mantra was simple yet profound. Courageous people do not fear forgiving for the sake of peace. He was the ultimate chess player, always thinking several moves ahead, balancing the need for reconciliation with the demands for retribution. The negotiations culminated in the historic 1994 general election, a watershed moment that saw Mandela elected as South Africa's first black president. On April 27, 1994, the country held its breath as millions of South Africans, many voting for the first time, queued at polling stations across the land. It was a logistical feat that would have made even the most seasoned event planner break into a sweat. Over 19 million ballots were cast, and the African National Congress, ANC, won a resounding victory, securing 63% of the vote. Mandela's inauguration on May 10, 1994, was a celebration of democracy, unity, and the triumph of the human spirit. Yet, with great power came great responsibility. Mandela's presidency was no walk in the park. It was more like a tightrope walk across the Grand Canyon with a crosswind. The challenges were immense. Rebuilding a nation fractured by decades of racial division, addressing rampant poverty, and creating an inclusive economy. South Africa was a land of paradoxes, where the glittering wealth of the cities was juxtaposed against the stark poverty of the townships. The task was daunting, like trying to rebuild a house while the roof was still leaking. Mandela's government focused on reconciliation and nation-building, ushering in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, to address the atrocities of the past. It was a bold experiment in restorative justice, a national therapy session where victims and perpetrators could confront the truth and, hopefully, find healing. The TRC was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a man whose laughter was as infectious as his commitment to justice was unyielding. The Commission heard thousands of testimonies, revealing the horrors of apartheid with unflinching honesty. Economically, Mandela's policies sought to redress the inequalities of the past without spooking the business community. It was a fine line to tread, akin to juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. The Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, aimed to provide housing, healthcare and education, but the sheer scale of the task meant progress was slow. By the time Mandela stepped down in 1999, the foundation for a new South Africa had been laid, but the house was far from finished. Mandela's legacy is a tapestry of triumphs and tribulations, a testament to the power of perseverance and the complexities of realpolitik. His story is often romanticized, shrouded in a mythic aura that elevates him to near sainthood. But Mandela was no saint. He was a man who made difficult choices in the face of impossible odds. He was a leader who understood that true freedom required sacrifice and compromise, that the road to equality was marred by potholes and detours. The Mandela myth is seductive, offering a neat narrative of a hero who single-handedly brought down apartheid. But the truth is far messier, a web of collective action, international pressure, and relentless activism. Mandela was the face and heart of the movement, but it was the countless unnamed who were its backbone. The activists, the protesters, the ordinary citizens who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. In the years since Mandela's presidency, South Africa has faced its share of challenges. The journey to equality is ongoing, with persistent issues of poverty, inequality, and corruption casting long shadows. The ideals Mandela championed remain as relevant as ever, a reminder that the struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. For all his global acclaim, Mandela remained deeply human, a man who cherished simple pleasures and valued humility over hubris. He once quipped, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead." It's a reminder that legacy is crafted not by grand gestures, but by the everyday acts of kindness and courage that ripple through time. As we wrap up this journey through Mandela's life, let's not forget the lessons his story imparts. It's a saga of resilience, hope, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It's a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most insurmountable odds. And it's a reminder that while history may sometimes be written by the victors, it's lived by the everyday heroes who dare to dream, to fight, and to forge a future where freedom isn't just an aspiration, but a reality. So, as you drift off to sleep, Let Mandela's story be a lullaby of hope, a beacon of light in a world often shrouded in darkness. Remember that the struggle continues, that the journey is far from over, but that the spirit of Mandela lives on in every act of courage and in every heart that beats for justice. Because in the end, history isn't just a collection of dates and events, it's the story of us all, woven together by the threads of our shared humanity. Florence Nightingale was not your typical 19th century lady, the kind who'd gracefully sip tea, embroider doilies, and faint at the sight of a spider. Oh no, she was more likely to be found dissecting the spider to understand its anatomy, much to the horror of the genteel society around her. Born on May 12, 1820, in the city of Florence, yes, she was literally named after the place. She grew up in a world where women were expected to be seen, not heard, and definitely not found in the trenches battling diseases. Let's set the stage. The Industrial Revolution had been chugging along, churning out both steam engines and social upheaval. England was bustling, but it wasn't exactly a great time to be a woman with ambition. Women were supposed to be the angels of the house, fluttering around in crinolines, expertly running a household, and, if they were feeling particularly rebellious, maybe playing the piano. The idea of a woman having a career, especially in the grimy world of healthcare, was as shocking as suggesting that Queen Victoria might enjoy a punk rock concert. Florence's family was affluent, which in 1820s speak meant they were rich enough to have opinions about everything. Her father, William Nightingale, was a well-educated gentleman with a library full of books that he actually read, a rarity in itself. Her mother, Fanny Nightingale, was the epitome of the social butterfly, floating through events and ensuring her daughters were well versed in the art of not offending anyone. But Florence? She was the family anomaly, more interested in statistics than social gatherings, a fact that probably made Fanny reach for her smelling salts more than once. From a young age, Florence felt a calling to help others, which she described as a message from God. Now, in the 19th century, a divine calling was usually interpreted as marry a clergyman, not transform healthcare. But Florence was not about to let societal norms dictate her life. She was determined to become a nurse, a profession that at the time was less angelic caregiver and more untrained servant, usually reserved for women with few options and even fewer prospects. Nursing was about as prestigious as mucking out stables, but Florence saw it differently. To her, it was a science, an opportunity to apply her love of math to improve hospital conditions. Her family, understandably, was less than thrilled. They envisioned Florence as the mistress of a grand estate, not scrubbing floors in a hospital. The Nightingales were horrified at the idea of their daughter mingling with the sick and poor, the kind of people they preferred to support from a safe distance, preferably through charity balls where gloves and good manners were mandatory. But Florence was not easily swayed. She was determined to redefine what it meant to be a nurse, and more importantly, what it meant to be a woman in the 19th century. Florence's determination was matched only by her wit. When her parents insisted she focus on finding a suitable husband, she reportedly quipped that she had no time for such trivialities. This was a woman who'd rather be in the company of fever charts than frilly bonnets. Her family dynamics were a comedy of errors, with Florence playing the role of the determined protagonist against the backdrop of her well-intentioned but utterly bewildered family. Florence's relationship with her sister, Parthenope, another city-inspired name, but let's call her Parthy, was particularly amusing. Partha embodied the ideal Victorian woman, dutifully fulfilling her societal role while Florence was off trying to revolutionize healthcare. The sisters shared a close bond but were as different as chalk and cheese. Parthy often tried to lure Florence into the societal fold, while Florence tried to convince Parthy of the excitement of mortality rates and sanitation statistics. Their letters are a testament to this tug-of-war, with Florence's filled with medical musings and Parthy's with gentle reminders of upcoming social events. Despite the familial circus, Florence was determined to carve her own path. She managed to convince her parents to let her study nursing in Germany at the Institution of Protestant Deaconesses in Kaiserswerth in 1851, where she spent 3 months learning everything from patient care to hospital administration. It was an eye-opening experience, cementing her belief that nursing was not just a job but a calling, one she was destined to answer, whether Victorian society liked it or not. By the time Florence returned to England, she was ready to take on the world, armed with her newfound knowledge and a burning desire to change the perception of nursing. She was like a one-woman army, fighting against the tide of public opinion and familial expectations with a scalpel in one hand and a statistical chart in the other. Her vision was clear: to make nursing a respected profession, one that played a crucial role in the medical field, not just an afterthought. Florence's story is a reminder that even in a world that insists on pigeonholing people into neat little boxes, there are those like her who refuse to conform. She rejected the societal norms of her time with a tenacity that is both inspiring and, frankly, a little intimidating. Florence Nightingale was a trailblazer, not just for women, but for anyone who's ever felt the call to challenge the status quo. She didn't just change the world of nursing, she changed the world, period. And she did it all with a smile on her face and a glint in her eye that said, "Just you wait and see." Florence Nightingale's story doesn't just mosey along, it gallops like a cavalry charge into the annals of history. After her transformative stint in Germany, Florence was anything but satisfied. Her appetite for knowledge was insatiable, much to the chagrin of her family, who probably hoped she'd settle into a more appropriate hobby like flower arranging or needlepoint. But Florence had bigger fish to fry, or perhaps, more accurately, bigger germs to study. Once she returned to England, Florence was armed not only with an understanding of healthcare that would make most Victorian men faint, but also with a network of European contacts that would be the envy of any LinkedIn user today. Her time in Kaiserswerth had been eye-opening, but it was merely the appetizer in her educational banquet. She was determined to become the pioneer of public health, and she set her sights on France for the main course. France, in the mid-1800s, was a hotbed of medical innovation, thanks in part to folks like Louis Pasteur, who was busy laying the groundwork for germ theory. Now, if you think Victorian England was stuffy, France was like a tightly corked bottle of champagne, ready to explode with new ideas. Florence took to Paris like a duck to water, soaking up medical knowledge and charming the local intelligentsia with her English wit and sharp mind. While in France, she studied at the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul in Paris, a place where the nuns were more like nursing ninjas than demure sisters. Here, she learned the ropes of patient care, hospital management, and sanitation practices. She watched operations, observed patient treatments, and took notes faster than you can say laissez-faire. The French seemed to have a knack for blending the art of medicine with the science of it, and Florence was all ears. Her travels were not just a jaunt through Europe, but a deliberate strategy to gather intelligence. She met some truly eccentric characters along the way, including a German doctor who reportedly used leeches like some people use post-it notes, liberally and with great enthusiasm. While the Victorians were busy clutching their pearls, Florence was busy clutching her notebooks, full of insights that would later revolutionize nursing. Florence's journey was not without its absurdities. In a world where women were often seen as mere ornaments, she had to navigate societal expectations with the deftness of a trapeze artist. She adopted a strategy of what you might call strategic compliance. While she complied with certain societal norms enough to maintain respectability, she always had her eye on the larger goal of changing the healthcare landscape. Picture her at a Parisian salon, politely sipping tea while subtly steering the conversation towards sanitation statistics. She was nothing if not tenacious. And let's not forget the societal barriers she had to dodge. In a time when the phrase women's education was considered almost an oxymoron, Florence had to fight tooth and nail for every scrap of knowledge. Her determination to learn was akin to a modern student taking advanced calculus just for fun, both admirable and slightly terrifying. Florence wasn't just collecting knowledge like others collected stamps. She was building a blueprint for a future she envisioned. Her travels across Europe were like a medical scavenger hunt, each stop contributing another piece to the puzzle. By the time she returned to England, she had acquired not just practical skills, but a vision for what healthcare could become. A vision that was as revolutionary as it was ambitious. But let's take a quick reality check. The myth of Florence as a lone genius is as appealing as it is misleading. Sure, she was a force of nature, but she knew how to play the game. She leveraged her family's connections and her own charm to gain access to places and people that many could only dream of. In a world where who you knew was often more important than what you knew, Florence was practically a social ninja, using her network to gather support for her burgeoning ideas. Despite the obstacles, Florence was relentless in her pursuit of knowledge. She was a woman who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, and she was determined to drag it kicking and screaming into a new era of healthcare. Whether she was navigating the rigid structures of Victorian society or charming her way through the salons of Paris, Florence Nightingale was nothing short of a revolutionary in crinolines. Her journey through the labyrinth of European healthcare systems was only just beginning. As she returned to England, her mind was a hive of activity, buzzing with ideas and plans that would soon collide with the harsh realities of the Crimean War. But that, dear listeners, is a story for another day. For now, we leave Florence on the cusp of greatness, poised to take on the world with a determination as unyielding as her legendary lamp. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. Florence Nightingale was about to leap from the frying pan of Victorian society into the fire of the Crimean War, a conflict that would make any sensible person reconsider their life choices. But Florence? She was more than ready to roll up her sleeves and dive into the chaos, scalpel in hand, and an unshakable resolve in her heart. The Crimean War, for those of you who might have skipped that chapter in history class, was a delightful little skirmish between the Russian Empire and an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, France, Britain, and Sardinia. It kicked off in October 1853 and dragged on until February 1856. A messy affair that was as much about geopolitical posturing as it was about actual combat. Now, let's set the scene. In 1854, the British government found itself in a bit of a pickle. The hospitals in Scutari, located in modern-day Istanbul, were overrun with wounded soldiers, and the conditions were enough to make even the hardiest nurse recoil. Think Dickensian workhouses, but with a side of contagious diseases and a dash of military incompetence. The sanitary conditions were so abysmal that soldiers were more likely to perish from typhus, cholera, or dysentery than from enemy fire. Enter Florence Nightingale, who was about to turn this grim picture into her personal battlefield for reform. Florence arrived in Scutari in November 1854 with a team of 38 nurses, a number that might sound impressive until you realize they were tasked with caring for thousands of wounded soldiers. The British Army, in its infinite wisdom, had somehow forgotten that logistics are kind of important when you're, fighting a war. Supplies were scarce, and the hospitals were in such a state of disarray that even rats were probably considering filing a complaint. But Florence, with her trademark blend of grit and statistical acumen, was undeterred. She quickly set about organizing the hospitals with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker envious. One of her first orders of business was to address the ludicrously outdated medical practices that were all the rage at the time. Picture this: doctors performing surgeries with instruments they hadn't bothered to clean since the last patient, and hygiene being treated as an optional extra. Florence knew that infection was the real enemy here, and she launched a sanitation campaign that involved more scrubbing than a Victorian chimney sweep convention. She introduced hand-washing protocols and insisted on cleaning everything in sight. Her efforts reduced the hospital's death rate from a ghastly 42% to a more manageable 2% within 6 months. That's right, she cut the death toll by 40%, all without the aid of modern antibiotics or disinfectants. If that's not impressive, I don't know what is. But Florence's war wasn't just against germs, it was also against bureaucracy. The military hierarchy was as tangled as a bowl of spaghetti, and getting things done required navigating a maze of red tape that would make any modern-day office worker nod in weary recognition. Supplies were stuck in bureaucratic limbo, and the army's procurement process was about as efficient as a one-legged man in a sack race. Florence, never one to shy away from a challenge, tackled these obstacles with her usual tenacity. She wrote detailed reports, lobbied officials, and generally harangued anyone who would listen until things started to change. Now, let's talk about the lady with the lamp image that emerged during this period, a myth as enduring as it is misleading. The image of Florence Nightingale making her nightly rounds, lamp in hand, became a symbol of her dedication and compassion. It's a romantic notion, to be sure, and one that caught the public's imagination. But the reality was a bit more, shall we say, complex. Yes, she did carry a lamp, but her rounds were as much about data collection as they were about tender care. Florence was counting, observing, and taking notes, all while ensuring the soldiers received the best care possible under horrendous circumstances. The British public, desperate for a hero amid the grim reports from the front, seized upon this image with gusto. Florence became a media sensation, the Victorian equivalent of a rock star. Articles and illustrations celebrated her as the Angel of the Crimea, a title she found both amusing and a touch exasperating. In her eyes, the real work was being done not by one woman with a lamp, but by a team of dedicated professionals committed to saving lives under impossible conditions. Florence Nightingale's role in the Crimean War was nothing short of transformative. She didn't just treat patients, she changed the very fabric of military medicine. Her meticulous record-keeping and use of statistics were revolutionary, laying the groundwork for modern hospital administration. She collected data on mortality rates, causes of death, and hospital conditions, using this information to advocate for systemic changes. Florence knew that numbers had power, and she wielded them like a sword in her ongoing battle for reform. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The medical establishment was not exactly thrilled by this upstart woman pointing out their glaring deficiencies. Florence's methods and conclusions ruffled more than a few feathers among the old guard, who were none too pleased about taking lessons from someone they considered a dilettante. Yet, Florence's results were undeniable, and slowly but surely her ideas began to gain traction. Her time in Scutari was both a crucible and a catalyst, forging her into a leader whose influence would extend far beyond the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale emerged not just as a pioneer of nursing, but as a formidable advocate for public health reform. Her work would inspire generations of healthcare professionals and set standards that continue to resonate today. As the war dragged on, Florence's health began to falter under the relentless strain, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had entered the fray determined to make a difference, and by any measure she succeeded spectacularly. Yet the story of Florence Nightingale is far from over. The woman who transformed the chaos of war into a laboratory for reform was about to take her findings back to England, where her real work would begin. Stay tuned, because the saga of Florence Nightingale is one that continues to evolve, with lessons that are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Florence Nightingale had returned to England, her mind still buzzing with the echoes of cannon fire and the rustle of hospital linens. She came home not as a weary traveller, but as a woman on a mission. The Crimean War may have ended, but for Florence, the real battle was just beginning. The war on unsanitary hospitals, the fight against bureaucratic inertia, and perhaps the most formidable foe of all, societal indifference. First, let's talk numbers, because Florence absolutely adored them. Fresh off her success in reducing the Scutari hospital death rate by 40%, she was raring to wield statistics like a mathematical Excalibur. Her weapon of choice? The polar area diagram, affectionately dubbed the Nightingale Rose. This wasn't your typical Victorian flower arrangement. It was a graphical marvel that illustrated monthly death rates in the Crimean hospitals. Think of it as the infographic that launched 1,000 reforms. Florence's diagrams were so compelling that even Queen Victoria, not exactly known for her fondness of data visualization, took notice. Florence's statistical work was groundbreaking, though not in the traditional sense of, let's solve this equation, groundbreaking. No, Florence's figures were as much about shaming the establishment as they were about revealing truths. Her data showed that most soldiers were dying from preventable diseases rather than battle wounds. It was the kind of revelation that made government officials squirm in their starched collars. In a time when statistics were about as popular as a toothache, Florence used her findings to lobby for sanitation reform in military hospitals, and boy did she make a fuss. But it wasn't all pie charts and public shaming. Florence had a knack for charming the right people at the right time. Picture her in meetings with government officials, effortlessly blending wit and grit. She had the kind of charisma that could make even the most stubborn bureaucrat consider a new perspective. Florence's interactions with officials were like a masterclass in persuasion. She knew how to pepper her speeches with enough humour to make her points palatable, while never losing sight of her ultimate goal, change. Now, let's not forget the economic context. The British government had just poured resources into a costly war, and they weren't exactly eager to open their wallets for healthcare reforms. Florence had to make a compelling economic case for her proposals. She argued that improved sanitation would reduce the cost of treating soldiers and increase the efficiency of military operations. It was a pragmatic approach, one that appealed to the penny pinchers in Parliament. By illustrating that healthier soldiers meant a leaner, meaner military machine, she made reform not just a moral imperative, but a fiscal one. But Florence wasn't just about military hospitals. Oh no, she had her sights set on the broader healthcare system in Britain. She was like a healthcare hurricane sweeping through Victorian society with a force that was impossible to ignore. In 1857, her efforts culminated in the publication of Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency and Hospital Administration of the British Army. It was a 600-page behemoth, a tome that detailed her findings and recommendations. This wasn't light reading, it was more like the Magna Carta of military healthcare reform. Her recommendations included everything from hospital design to dietary improvements. She even suggested that hospitals be located away from swamps and crowded urban areas, revolutionary ideas at a time when ventilation was considered a fancy French word. Florence might have been ahead of her time, but she was determined to drag the rest of the world kicking and screaming into the future. Now, remember the myth of Florence as just the lady with the lamp? That romantic image glosses over the fact that she was also a savvy networker. She wasn't above using her social connections to advance her cause. Florence was a fixture in the drawing rooms of the powerful and influential, where she lobbied for support with the kind of finesse that could make a diplomat blush. It was here, in these smoke-filled rooms, that she sowed the seeds for what would become her greatest legacy, the Nightingale School of Nursing. Established in 1860 at St. Ciny at Sancti, Thomas's Hospital in London, the Nightingale School was the first secular nursing school in the world. Florence had long dreamed of professionalizing nursing, and this was her chance to make it happen. She envisioned a world where nurses were trained professionals, respected for their expertise and dedication. The school's curriculum was rigorous, combining practical experience with theoretical knowledge. It was like Hogwarts for nurses, minus the magic wands and talking hats. The establishment of the school wasn't just about education, it was about social change. Florence's vision challenged the prevailing notion that nursing was a job for the uneducated and the desperate. She wanted to attract intelligent, capable women to the profession, and she succeeded. Graduates of her program were in high demand, not just in Britain but around the world. They carried the Nightingale legacy with them, spreading her principles like seeds on the wind. Florence's post-war efforts were as complex as they were impactful. She was a woman who saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. Her work laid the foundation for modern nursing and set the stage for the healthcare reforms that would follow. But Florence Nightingale's story doesn't end here. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk and truths to tell. So, stay tuned, because Florence's impact would ripple far beyond her lifetime, touching countless lives and reshaping the future of healthcare. Florence Nightingale's impact on nursing and public health is as profound as it is far-reaching. Her legacy is not just a footnote in history, it's the very foundation upon which modern nursing stands. But before we get too misty-eyed over the lady with the lamp, let's take a closer look at the gritty realities and the myths that have grown around her like ivy on an old stone wall. First off, Florence's statistical prowess was no mere parlour trick. Her use of data to drive reforms was revolutionary. In a time when most people were more interested in tea parties than pie charts, she was using numbers like a 19th century superhero. Her meticulous data collection didn't just improve conditions in military hospitals, it set a precedent for evidence-based practices in healthcare. This was a woman who made numbers dance to her tune, and she did it with the kind of flair that would make a mathematician swoon. Florence's influence on public health policies extended far beyond the borders of Britain. Her reports and recommendations became essential reading for health reformers worldwide. In India, for instance, she advised the colonial government on sanitation and healthcare improvements, using her trademark blend of charm and relentless advocacy. Her work contributed to the eventual establishment of practices that would save countless lives. Talk about a global impact. Florence was the original international health consultant, and she didn't even have to hop on a Zoom call. But let's not get too carried away with the hero worship. The romanticized image of Florence Nightingale as the lone angel of mercy tends to overshadow the reality of her later years. After the Crimean War, Florence was largely bedridden due to chronic illness, possibly brucellosis or spondylitis. Despite her physical limitations, her mind remained as sharp as a scalpel. She continued to write, strategize and influence from her sickbed, proving that you don't need to be on your feet to stand tall. Her later life was a testament to resilience in the face of adversity. While some might have taken to embroidery or perhaps penning their memoirs, Florence chose to tackle the mammoth task of healthcare reform. Her home became a hub of activity, a kind of Victorian command centre, where she marshalled her forces, communicated with officials, and continued her life's work. It was as if she had turned her illness into a strategy, less a setback and more a shift in tactics. Now, about those myths. The notion of Florence as a solitary crusader is as enduring as it is misleading. The truth is, she collaborated with a network of allies who shared her vision. These were dedicated professionals who worked tirelessly alongside her, and though history tends to single out Florence, she was never truly alone in her endeavours. Her achievements were the result of teamwork, a collective effort to push the boundaries of what was possible in healthcare. Florence's legacy is also a study in contrasts. While she was a champion for women's education and empowerment, she was somewhat ambivalent about the women's suffrage movement. It's a curious inconsistency, but perhaps it speaks to the complexity of her character. She was a woman of her time, and yet, paradoxically, she was ahead of it. Her focus was always on practical outcomes, often preferring to work within the system to achieve change rather than tearing it down completely. And then there's the matter of her legend. Florence Nightingale has become almost a mythical figure, a status that brings its own peculiar set of challenges. She's been depicted in everything from novels to films, often cast as the quintessential benevolent nurse. Yet these portrayals tend to gloss over her more formidable qualities, her strategic mind, her stubbornness, and her unyielding drive. The real Florence was a complex tapestry of compassion and calculation, a blend that doesn't fit neatly into the angelic caregiver's narrative. In examining her legacy, it's important to recognize both the romance and the reality. Yes, she was the lady with the lamp, but she was also a relentless reformer, a statistician extraordinaire, and a pioneer who changed the landscape of healthcare forever. Her impact is felt not just in the hospitals she helped reform, but in every nursing school, every public health initiative, and every healthcare policy that bears her influence. As we conclude this journey through Florence Nightingale's life, let's leave behind the sepia-toned myths and appreciate the vivid reality. She was a force of nature in crinolines, a woman who defied the expectations of her time and reshaped the world in her image. Her legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern healthcare, a testament to the enduring power of vision and tenacity. So, here's to Florence, a pioneer, a pragmatist, and yes, a legend. Her story is a compelling reminder that change is not a product of myth, but of relentless, unwavering effort.